Hello, everybody. You are listening to Through Time and Clades. My name is Albert.
And I'm Joe.
Yeah, and welcome back to our show. This week we are continuing my series looking at the evolution of modern type birds. Um, and so this week it's going to be, I think we're going to be looking at some pretty interesting groups this week. Of course, I think all birds are interesting, but these ones are, you know, notable for being particularly specialized for specific type of environment. So I think they have quite a few unusual features that'll be interesting to talk about. Yeah, but I guess before we jump in, how's your week been going?
It's been going really good. Things are trucking along at home very smoothly. In about a week after this episode, after our recording of this episode, I'm going to be moving in to a new apartment with the folks
Wow.
and to begin the new a new chapter of our life as we begin to build the dream home that my folks have been planning for several months now. So definitely looking forward to that.
Wow, that's super exciting. Um, yeah, things have been pretty good on my end too. I've still been keeping quite busy, and that's probably not going to change anytime soon. But I guess the most exciting news that I can share this week is that I actually got a paper published, or at least a paper that I co-authored got published. Um,
Woohoo!
yeah. So this paper is quite different from the other papers that I have co-authored before. So this paper is not directly about dinosaurs or other kinds of prehistoric life or anything like that. Um, it is about a scientific outreach, and specifically, it is about a very successful science outreach project known as March Mammal Madness. Maybe you've heard of it if you're listening to this show. So it is an annual event that happens on Twitter during March, naturally. Well, it is led by Katie Hind, who studies mammal lactation, so production of milk, um, at Arizona State University, I believe. Um, but there are many other people who are involved in organizing the event. And what happens is every year they release a bracket, a bit like the actual March Madness tournament, but except in this case, the contestants in the bracket are all non-human animals and typically mammals, but increasingly they have started to include like non-mammalian species as well in the tournament. And in fact, as of the time of recording, they just released the tournament earlier today. So yeah, people can go take a look. This year's tournament is about to start up, and in fact, actually, they haven't even been limited just to animals because there have been a few years where they have had like plants competing and like things like bacteria and fungi even. So yeah, they actually cast quite a broad kind of taxonomic net in terms of the species they feature. Though of course they do focus on mammals mostly. And the way it works is the winners have been predetermined by kind of random number generation, basically. Um, but the results are only known to the organizers. And so at pre-announced kind of dates, the organizers narrate on Twitter basically the kind of hypothetical events that are happening during the tournament. So when what happens when different species encounter each other, and again the results are already predetermined by a random number generator, but the organizers craft basically a narrative of the tournament around what the random number generator produces. So they basically have to come up with a story for why a certain species wins over the other or whatever. Um, and by winning, it doesn't mean necessarily defeating in a fight, although sometimes that happens in the tournament. Sometimes an animal just leaves the setting, and that counts as a forfeit. Sometimes a third party comes in and takes one of them out. Anyways, it's quite at least watching the reactions on Twitter, it can be quite nail biting. A lot of people are very anxious to see whether or not their own predictions are going to come true or not. And the way I kind of got involved in this, so I am not officially part of like the core organizing team, but previously I hadn't really been following the tournament that closely. I was aware of it, but yeah, I wasn't following it that closely. But one year I decided, it's a really popular hashtag. Lots of people are looking at this, so I thought it would be a nice opportunity to, kind of jump on the bandwagon, I guess, and get a little bit of science communication in there myself. So I decided to make a phylogenetic diagram showing kind of the evolutionary relationships between every species that was competing in the tournament for that year. And so I posted that on Twitter, and then and every time results would come out, I would update the phylogeny to show which organisms were still in the race and which weren't. And so that got a little bit of traction, and I've been doing that for the past few years now, just releasing a phylogeny of contestants every year. And so when they were deciding to write this paper, basically explaining the premise of March Mammal Madness and also discussing kind of its effectiveness for doing science communication, the lead author, Katie Hind, asked me, "Hey, you've been making these cool phylogenies about March Mammal Madness. Would you like to be on this paper?" And yeah, so that's how I got involved. It's pretty fun. So of course I wasn't too involved with the actual writing of the paper. I did read over the draft and made a few suggestions, but since I'm not part of the core organizing committee, I don't I didn't have too much to say about the specific details of the paper. But what I did do was I put together kind of a mega phylogeny of all the species that have ever been in March Mammal Madness, and yeah, it ended up being quite a big poster because March Mammal Madness has been going for quite a few years now. I think the first year was 2013, I think. Yeah, so lots and lots of species in that tree, and so they have actually added that big mega phylogeny to kind of one of their educator materials collections, which is hosted by the Arizona State University. So and anyone who wants additional resources for participating in March Mammal Madness or using it in classrooms, which a lot of teachers apparently have been doing. Can go in and download the big phylogeny showing the relationships between all those organisms if they want to. So yeah, that was kind of my main contribution to that project, and it was a lot of fun. So yeah, I'll try to remember to put a link to the paper, which is open access, in the description below.
Oh, that's awesome. I definitely am familiar with Mammal March Madness, although I haven't personally participated
Mm.
in any of them to my knowledge. Um, I remember a couple of years back they had like the Dino March Madness. That was
Oh
by
yeah.
a friend that I participated in a couple of those because they had like the polls where you voted which dinosaur you
Right,
wanted.
right.
I think I had some stakes on a number
Yeah.
of species. Like there was one year in particular where I think like we were doing like obscure taxa, like fossils where it's like, oh, it's like part of a leg bone and that's all
Right.
we know about this animal. And I was trying to push it towards those just to kind of get some. Well, just one, it would be like kind of funny, but also like kind of like raise awareness of
Right, right.
like
Oh,
of
that's
these
pretty funny.
animals. Like look how cool! Like it's a whole new species, but it's we only know
Right.
about like half of its leg, and it would be different for a change instead of like, oh, it's Spinosaurus.
You're again.
You're winning.
You're right, right. Yeah, yeah. Dinosaur March Madness is also quite fun. So that one's organized by our friend Meg Dixon, although they are taking a break from kind of Tumblr at the moment, or at least the kind of regular blogging at least. But
Right.
back when Airblog was active, it was an extremely successful science outreach kind of platform as well. And I we actually organized a few science outreach events on our blog that ended up being scientific presentations at the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology conference. So if we wanted to write a paper about those, we probably could, but I guess everybody involved is just so busy that we haven't really gotten around to doing it. But yeah, it's definitely a kind of it's definitely a fun kind of theme that a lot of science educators have jumped on the kind of March Madness format to try and raise awareness of whatever subjects they study, and overall it seems that it's often quite successful. So yeah,
Absolutely. I mean, it's a great idea in
indeed,
general.
right. But yeah, I guess if we don't have anything other introductory stuff to go through, we can go into the actual kind of bird portion of the episode.
Yeah, let's dive right in.
Yeah, I see what you did there. Yeah, so this week's episode is called Dinosaurs of the Sea. And I definitely chose this title very deliberately. Now, if you read a lot of children's books about dinosaurs, I think you're quite likely to come across some line along the lines of dinosaurs did not swim or fly or things like that. Um,
Oh yeah.
yeah. So, you know, even before we knew that birds were dinosaurs, I think the idea that dinosaurs couldn't swim is kind of nonsense because pretty much every vertebrate can swim, like with very very few exceptions, and there isn't really much reason to suppose that Mesozoic dinosaurs were any different. Um, some other books are a little bit more cautious about this, and they will instead say things like no dinosaur lived in the water, or no dinosaur was aquatic, or things like that, which is a bit more understandable. So certainly, there seem to have been very few Mesozoic dinosaurs with aquatic adaptations, but they are not non-existent. And so, especially with a lot of recent discoveries, and also with the knowledge that birds are in fact dinosaurs, we actually do know of quite a few aquatically adapted dinosaur groups. And so, if we move to the next slide, I actually have listed a number of examples of aquatic dinosaurs here. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. There are a number of groups here that I couldn't fit onto the slide. So these aren't even all the aquatically adapted dinosaurs that we know of. But there are definitely some of the more famous or bizarre or well-known ones or more diverse ones. So yeah, let's have a look. Now, one group that has been a real kind of headline grabber are, of course, the Spinosaurids up there in the top left. And specifically, the genus Spinosaurus has been getting quite a lot of attention in recent years, especially. And this is because, well, I guess to kind of go a bit further back, we've actually known that Spinosaurids were probably at least water-associated predators for a while. So thanks to the very well-preserved skeleton of Baryonyx from the early Cretaceous of England, which has preserved fish bones inside its gut cavity. And plus, combined with that kind of very long and narrow snout with a lot of, conical teeth for gripping slippery things, presumably, it has been inferred that Spinosaurids were primarily, hunters of perhaps aquatic prey, although not necessarily limited to it. And then in more recent years, more complete material of the genus Spinosaurus from the late Cretaceous of North Africa has been uncovered, which seemed to suggest that it perhaps had even more extreme aquatic adaptations than typical Spinosaurids. So its hind limbs appear to have been much shorter than in other Spinosaurids. And of course, last year the big news was that it seems to have had these very tall projections along the spine, not just on its back, which were well known previously, but also along its tail as well. It seemed to form kind of a paddle shaped structure, which has been interpreted as an adaptation for swimming. And so, yeah, because of that, Spinosaurus has gotten quite a lot of attention for being, this big, potentially highly aquatic, large theropod. There is quite a lot of debate, to say the least, about, exactly how it behaved. I would say paleontologists in general would agree that it probably was strongly associated with aquatic environments and probably did feed a lot from the water. But there's definitely quite a bit of turmoil over, whether or not it was kind of chasing prey in the water or if it was kind of more standing in shallow water and ambushing prey. Um, so yeah, that's a that's some ongoing discourse there. And yeah, if you mention Spinosaurs at all in the online paleo community, you almost guaranteed to start an intense argument of some form or another. Um, and honestly, it's been this way even before like these recent finds, because of course Jurassic Park 3 and the whole could Spinosaurus beat T-Rex in a fight. And anyways,
Oh,
yeah, anyways, yeah, we don't need to go into that there. But it does seem to be true that the Spinosaurids were quite you know strongly water associated group of theropod dinosaurs back in the Mesozoic. A group that was much more recently recognized is the Hauscaraptorines on the lower left. So this is a group of small dromaeosaurid dinosaurs. So they are close relatives of Velociraptor and Deinonychus and those guys. Uh, but yeah, they were small, so like duck-sized or so, tiny, tiny little things, and they have some unusual features which have been interpreted as possibly adaptations for an aquatic associated environment. They have these long snouts and a long neck, which you can see in the skeleton there. And their snouts have lots of little teeth in them. So these seem to be features that are often found in fish-eating animals, the long neck and the long snout for grabbing fish. And also their forelimbs were quite short, but the bones in the forelimbs were slightly flattened. Um, and so the describers of Hauscaraptor specifically, which was the one that showed how weird they were, because previously other members of this group were known, but their skeletons weren't as complete, so we didn't realize that they were these super weird kind of little um, dromaeosaurids. And so we just kind of thought they were small dromaeosaurs, but maybe not particularly weird. Um, in any case, the describers of Hauscaraptor specifically interpret kind of its forelimb structure as being possibly useful for moving around in the water in some manner. Like maybe it wasn't necessarily uh, propelling itself a lot through the water like a penguin would. Like maybe it wasn't like diving through the water, but it might have helped it kind of move around a little bit. Maybe it was floating on the surface and it kind of had to push itself along the surface of the water, things like that. Um, they, there's still a lot of work to be done on kind of the functional aspects of Hauscaraptorine biology, so I wouldn't be surprised if our understanding of them changed quite dramatically in the near future. But it does seem that they might have been water associated predators as well. Um, Moving onwards, we have Gonsus up there, so second from the top left. And Gonsus was a quite close relative of modern birds that lived in the early Cretaceous of China. And I say quite close relatives. It was very modern bird-like in terms of its skeleton. Like pretty much, it only differs from modern birds in quite minor details. Um, we have undescribed skulls of Gonsus, although not like I said, undescribed. So uh, they we don't have like a complete picture of what its skull was like yet. But we do have other other species that are quite similar to it. Things like Itoravis from around the same time and place. Um, that had toothy snouts. So in terms of their skull, they were still quite a bit different from modern birds, but the rest of the skeleton is very, very modern in a sense. And it seems that Gonsus was probably a kind of specialized diving dinosaur. So the features of its hind limbs suggest that it was able to use them to dive through the water. Diving birds tend to have very distinctive hind limb bones, so that seems to be pretty convincing in Gonsus. And it also has soft tissue preservation that suggests that it had webbed feet. So yeah, this was definitely probably some kind of semi-aquatic creature that we're dealing with here. And then living mostly later in time than Gonsus, we have the Hesperornithes, and these are some of the most specialized aquatic dinosaurs of all time. Um, they were also very closely related to modern birds. In fact, they were probably more closely related to modern birds than Gonsus. Um, Hesperornithes, the earlier members of Hesperornithes from the early Cretaceous appear to have been able to fly, but once you get to the late Cretaceous forms, they become very specialized for diving to the point where they were completely flightless. And in fact, their forelimbs were almost lost, basically. Um, in some cases, like it appears in Hesperornis, for example, which is one of the best studied and one of the most completely known species, or rather genera. It didn't have any forearms at all, so it basically just had these little stumps of its upper arms as its wings. So it probably wasn't using them for a whole lot. So primarily, these were also foot-propelled diving birds. So they had very strongly built hind limbs that were specialized for propelling them through the water. Um, and in fact, it seems likely that similar to some other birds we'll see today, that kind of the upper part, basically the thigh of their hind limbs, was mostly encased kind of inside their body. Like it wasn't like sticking out from their body and able to freely kind of move around. Um, so that is a kind of adaptation we see in some very specialized diving birds, and that seems to have been the case in the later Hesperornithes as well. And because of this, it's possible that the larger forms, especially, probably could not move around on land very well. Yeah, in fact, they might have had to just slide around on their bellies and kind of push themselves along with their hind limbs, which would have been sticking out behind them. Um, so probably quite awkward on land. And speaking of size, I guess they could get quite big. Like something like Hesperornis could get to like a meter and a half long, maybe even bigger than that. So yeah, these are quite large and very bird-like dinosaurs that lived during the Cretaceous and were highly, highly specialized for aquatic life. The bigger ones are mostly known from marine environments, but we also know of Hesperornithiforms from freshwater environments as well. So they were quite a successful group. Um, all right. The remaining groups on the slide are all crown birds, so modern type birds. And you can guess from the fact that they're all represented by photos of living birds here. Yep, they are all crown birds. And some of them we've already met before. So, of course, there are the Anseriformes, the ducks and their relatives, which are, of course, in many cases, highly aquatic, spending a lot of their time on the water and sometimes diving underneath it. And they are quite a successful group of aquatic dinosaurs because they have colonized just about any kind of aquatic habitat there is to colonize, except for open ocean. Um, there's also the Mirandornithes, the flamingos and grebes, and you might remember this group from our introduction to the group Neoaves, the group that includes 95% of all modern birds. So Mirandornithes include the grebes, which are specialized foot-propelled diving birds. So they're a bit like the Hesperornithiforms in that respect. Not very good at getting around on land, but superb divers. And of course, the flamingos are wading birds, so they wade out into the water, and they are filter feeders. So they filter for tiny bits of food particles in the water, algae or small animals. And flamingos are also capable of swimming as well. So, of course, also very closely tied to water. Charadriforms we met last time. So these are the shorebirds. And of course, many shorebirds live on the margins of aquatic environments, although some have also colonized very dry environments too, as we discussed in the last episode. But they also have evolved into very specialized, kind of, you could say, truly aquatic forms that live out in the open waters. And last time we talked about the auks, especially. These are wing-propelled divers, so they swim by flapping their wings underwater. And some of the auks spend, you know, well, I would say pretty much all the auks spend most of their lives out at sea, but some of them are particularly extreme in that respect, spending just a few days after they hatch on land and then immediately running to the ocean and spending their lives out there until they're old enough to breed, and then after they pretty much only come back to land to lay their eggs. Um, they are definitely a highly aquatic group, and it could be argued that some of these auks are the most aquatic dinosaurs that we know of. Of course, we don't know whether some of the Hesperornithes might beat that record or not, because of course we can't tell how long they spend in the water every year. But either way, they're definitely up there. However, it is quite striking that a great diversity of aquatically adapted birds are all closely related, and they form a clade. And so, it is this group of birds, which I have on here labeled the waterbird clade, that we are going to discuss in this episode. And so, as you can see here, kind of the invasion into aquatic environments by dinosaurs has actually happened quite a lot of times. And again, this isn't even all the different times that dinosaurs have evolved aquatic habits. So kind of the idea that dinosaurs never became aquatic. Yeah, no, not true at all. And even if you exclude the crowned birds, we still have all the super specialized Hesperornithiforms and and some of the other at least semi-aquatic groups out there. So definitely, it's something that dinosaurs have dabbled in, you could say. It is quite notable, however, that it seems that dinosaurs didn't commonly become semi-aquatic until you get very close to crowned birds and their close relatives, because out of the groups on here, half of them are crowned birds, right? And Gonsus and Hesperornithes are both very closely related to crowned birds. And in fact, we have a few other kind of bird-like dinosaurs from that part of the tree that also seem to have been aquatic, or at least living in near aquatic environments. But once you get a little bit further out, a little bit more distant, when you get into relatives that are a little bit more distantly related to crowned birds, it seems that this kind of lifestyle becomes a lot rarer. Now you have the Halscaraptorians, which are moderately close to crowned birds, and then the Spinosaurids, which are quite a bit further out. They are tetanurine theropods-like birds, but other than that, they are fairly distant relatives. And then outside of that, there isn't much kind of uncontroversial examples of aquatic dinosaurs. So it seems that it's really with the origin of birds that you get this kind of repeated invasion into water, the dinosaurian conquering of the sea, I guess. It's something that pretty much only happens in crowned birds and their closest relatives. And why that is not well studied and is not well understood. But we can say that dinosaurs eventually did do it, and they did it several times and have been very successful in it. And honestly, the aquatic specializations in a lot of these groups could put Spinosaurus to shame, basically. So every time I see news articles that are like Spinosaurus, the only aquatic dinosaur ever, it's like, no, that's completely wrong. Like, we know birds are dinosaurs now. Like, there are loads and loads of aquatic dinosaurs. It's just that most of them are either crowned birds or very close relatives of crowned birds. But nonetheless, dinosaurs did invade the sea, and we are going to meet quite a few of them coming right up. And yeah, eat your heart out, Spinosaurus.
I imagine that a lot of this discussion about like that in like previous books and stuff, that no dinosaurs colonized the sea or like took to the air, even excluding birds. I imagine that's like book authors' ways of saying like, oh, by the way, pterosaurs and plesiosaurs and all those guys, like, they're not dinosaurs.
Right, exactly. It is a shorthand. Yeah,
Yeah,
it is a shorthand for to keep people from confusing dinosaurs and those other reptile groups that were around during the Mesozoic, which of course are quite interesting in their own right. Yeah, but I guess in doing so, they have kind of created another misconception that
Right.
dinosaurs never flew or never went to never colonized aquatic environments, and of course that is not true. And as we see here, like even excluding crown birds, we still have a number of examples of kind of aquatic specialized dinosaurs.
Yeah.
Now, something that dinosaurs haven't been able to do that we know of is completely sever their ties to the land, because even the most aquatic birds, it seems, have to return to the land to lay their eggs. Um, and so far, as far as we know, no dinosaur group has evolved itself out of that requirement yet. Uh, but who knows? um,
Right. It's not the same problem with like a bird being like completely dedicated to living in the air. It's
right,
all about
right.
breeding in the end and laying eggs. It's just
That's right.
you gotta make that work somehow.
Right, yeah, yeah, and definitely some birds have gotten pretty close to that. We talked about swifts in a previous episode. They spend
Yeah.
most of their lives flying, but yeah, like even they have to land at some point to lay their eggs and rear their young. Um, and why birds have never evolved, or in fact, why dinosaurs in general have never evolved any kind of live birth is still a bit of an open question. There are definitely quite a few hypotheses about it, but yeah, so far it is not entirely clear why that is.
Right. I definitely remember, Bacher back in the day,
Mm.
famous Robert Bacher, and his whole, Apatosaurus gave birth to newborns, and then there was the whole thing with like pachycephalosaurs. Their hips were wide, therefore they probably maybe gave birth to live young. And as far as I understand, like, oh, I mean, those have been put to bed.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There. Yeah. As far as we know, it doesn't seem like any of those have really held up, or at least the evidence for it is not that strong. Um,
Right.
yeah. But who knows? Maybe someday we'll find a live bearing dinosaur. But at the moment, we got nothing.
Right. That would be something for
That
sure.
would be yeah. But yeah, in any case, we can go on to the next slide and meet this big waterbird clade. So, the waterbird clade, well, it is divided into two major groups, although one of these groups is much bigger in terms of species number than the others. And I keep calling it the waterbird clade in quotes there, because in terms of like the scientific literature, nobody has kind of formally coined or formally decided what name to put on this clade yet. So yeah, there's no current consensus on what name to call it. Um, Although there are a few possibilities that have been floated kind of informally. So I know John Boyd, who runs the very useful website, A Taxonomy in Flux, which is a website that's all about kind of molecular phylogenies of birds and kind of summarizing the recent consensus regarding the subject. He uses the name RDA for this group, and RDA is a kind of old, kind of 19th century name. That originally referred to things like herons and some other heron-like birds, although it turns out that not all of those birds are actually close relatives. But because herons are members of the waterbird clade, I guess it's fairly reasonable. And RDA, by the way, is named after the genus Ardea, which is a genus of herons. It is reasonable to bring it back and use it for this group. I don't have a problem with that. Although another possibility that could be used, which I have kind of currently kind of tentatively adopted, is Natatores, which is also another old name that was used originally for like kind of all aquatic birds, like things like ducks were also included in the Natatores. Um, but of course, eventually we realized that not all of these water birds were close relatives. But in relatively recent literature, there have still been a couple cases where people have used the name Natatores to refer to a group of core water birds, I guess. So a group of aquatic birds that are closely related. And most people haven't really picked up on this usage, but I think we can bring it back. I think we can justify bringing it back, and especially since in recent usage, kind of the taxonomic scope of the name Natatores is very close to what we now understand to be members of this clade. Um, I guess the main differences are that in recent uses of the name, grebes are included in Natatores, but currently we know that they are not actually members of this group. They are more closely related to flamingos. Um, but other than that, I think the overlap is certainly sufficient enough that we could perhaps use this name again. But yeah, we'll see. We'll see if anybody kind of makes that suggestion in the scientific literature. In any case, this waterbird clade can be divided into two main lineages. The first one, the much smaller group, is called Phaethontimorphs. These currently, that's the name that's been used for it in the literature. And the other group is called Acornithes, the Acornithians, which is a much larger group. And of course, we will cover each of them in turn. So on the next slide, we will start with the smaller Phaethontimorph group. And this is a very curious grouping. Um, yeah, so all members of this group have been somewhat problematic in terms of their taxonomy for a while. Um, yeah, it has been long been debated. What are these birds related to? And I, I don't think people, for most part, predicted that they're actually closely related to each other. Um, well, okay, the sunbitterns and the kagu, the two on the left there, have been considered close relatives for a while, and they do have a number of skeletal similarities and even behavioral similarities. Um, and so they have been considered close relatives. But traditionally, the group containing both of them has been considered one of those gruiform groups. You remember gruiforms? Yeah, so it used to be that a lot of, generally terrestrial kind of birds that walk around a lot on the ground and forage on the ground tend to be considered the members of the gruiform group, the group containing the cranes and rails. But especially with the kind of molecular data, we've kind of chucked out a lot of the former gruiforms. It turns out that they're not closely related to cranes and rails, and the sunbitterns and kagu were among the number of those that were chucked out. Um, and the tropic birds traditionally were thought to be closely related to things like pelicans and boobies and cormorants. And those birds are also members of this big waterbird clade, so in a sense they are still close relatives. But within the group, tropic birds are not especially closely related to the boobies and cormorants and pelicans and the rest. They are instead more closely related to, apparently, to the sunbitterns and the kagu. Um, so, that part, the part about tropic birds being closely related to the sunbitterns and kagu, that was unexpected, and that was something that was discovered by genetic data that wasn't predicted beforehand. And so far, people have looked a bit and tried to find anatomical similarities, but not we haven't been very successful so far. So this really is a kind of very enigmatic and mysterious group. And in part, that might be because we don't have a very good fossil record of the sunbittern and kagu lineages. So we're not really sure what the kind of their very early members might have looked like, as we'll get to. Um, but yeah, definitely very curious group. And until quite recently, the members of this group, the tropic birds, are like all three of these lineages, were considered possibly not to be closely related to Acornithes, the other lineage in this big waterbird clade. More like they were considered to be part of the so-called Metaves clade, which was recovered in some early kind of molecular analyses of birds, which was kind of a very motley assemblage of different bird groups, like including things like pigeons and the flamingos and grebes and the strysaures, the hummingbirds and swifts and nightjars, all of them kind of getting this big hodgepodge, all being on one lineage, and then the tropic birds and sunbitterns and kagu were among them. Um, yeah, but with newer analyses, we now think that the Metaves clade is not really a thing. It's not really a clade. That instead these groups are scattered around the different parts of the bird tree, and in more recent analyses, Phaethontimorphs are instead found usually more closely related to the Acornithes and forming a big waterbird group. And so it's possible that might change in the future with even more studies, but that seems to be the current most widespread consensus. So that's what we're going to go with here. Do you have anything to add to that?
No. I will admit though, I'm quite fond of the sunbitterns.
Yeah, I like this group a lot, and not only because how mysterious they are in terms of like scientifically, from a scientific standpoint, they're certainly very intriguing, but like all of these groups, they are so distinctive and have all their interesting quirks and things that they are great. I like this group a lot.
Yeah, they're pretty too.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. So we will meet each of these groups in turn. On the next slide, we will start with the sunbitterns, although there is only one living species, so it's the sunbittern. And so far, there are no definite fossils of this lineage that we know of, although there have been some suggestions that certain extinct birds are closely related to the sunbitterns and or to the kagu. Most of these have not been upheld over time. I think we talked about a few recently, actually. So I know in the gruiform episode, we talked about the mesalornithids, which are a group of very abundant rail-like birds from the Eocene, which have been considered possible relatives of sunbitterns and kagu. But in more recent studies, it seems that mesalornithids really are closely related to actual rails, so they are gruiforms, and so probably aren't closely related to these guys at all. And another group that has been considered possible relatives of sunbittern and kagu is the aidsbills from New Zealand, which were a group of recently extinct flightless predatory birds that probably ate kind of small animals, smaller birds, things like tuataras, lizards, large insects, things like that, and probably went extinct because of human pressures. We've recently had genetic analyses that include aidsbills, since they went extinct recently enough for genetic material to be extracted from some of the remains, and it seems that they are also true gruiforms and not closely related to the sunbittern and the kagu. There is also an Eocene fossil from the Green River Formation in the United States that has been considered possibly a stem member of the sunbittern group, maybe, but it hasn't been described yet. So yeah, there isn't that much information about it available. So in terms of published material, we don't currently have much of a fossil record for the sunbittern. It is certainly a very distinctive bird, though. It is found in the neotropics and mostly on the edges of freshwater environments. So it is a water-associated bird, even though it is not very specialized for moving through the water. It's not a specialized aquatic bird exactly. Mostly near forested habitats. They nest in trees, so usually they're found in near forested habitats. And probably one of their most distinctive features is their display, the threat display, which is shown here. So when they feel threatened, they will suddenly open their wings out and show these kind of bold patterns, including these two eye spots on their wings. And then they'll just kind of walk kind of fearlessly towards the aggressor, and in doing so, hopefully they manage to scare the predator or whatever they want to scare away. And evidently it works because it's been selected for. In fact, I think there is a segment in I think The Life of Birds maybe where they show a sunbittern doing this to intimidate a hawk or something like that. So that yeah, that's pretty cool, and definitely one of their most striking features. I've never been fortunate enough to visit the neotropics myself, but sunbitterns I have seen in zoos quite a bit, and they are always quite interesting to watch. They're definitely very I keep using the word distinctive, but they definitely are very distinctive birds and eye catching too once you manage to see them. Yeah, how about you? Have you seen them in captivity or?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Usually in like the the big aviaries at certain zoos, and
yeah,
yeah, you're right. I mean, like they stand out. Of course, it helps that like I'm familiar enough with these birds where I can like kind of spot them out in
right,
a
right,
crowd of birds. But like, yeah, there's like a presence that they have to
right,
themselves
yeah,
that you
yeah,
can't help but admire. Like they know, like I have my backup in case I'm pestered by another bird in this little aviary here.
right, right.
But they're fun.
Yeah, definitely. Uh, very, very cool bird, and of course, very interesting from an evolutionary perspective. Now, the closest living relative of the sunbittern is the kagu, which is on the next slide. Also, not really much of a fossil record, so we don't really know where they came from or how they came to be. But yeah, it it is also very unusual. It is only found on the island of New Caledonia, and also only one living species. It has been suggested that there is a recently extinct species of kagu that lived also on New Caledonia that was a bit bigger. Um, Although that is a bit controversial. Some people have suggested that maybe the bigger kagu, which we know from the subfossil record, that maybe they weren't a different species of kagu. It's just that kagu happened to grow bigger in those times, but currently are smaller, possibly because of human hunting and all that. Um, so yeah, it's a bit debated whether there was a separate species of kagu that is now recently extinct or not. In any case, the kagu, since it's restricted to you know a single island, it is of conservation concern certainly, and so there have been a few captive breeding programs, I believe, for it. Although I, in memory at least, I have been to one zoo that has had kagu, although I didn't get to see them. Frustratingly, yeah, that was the San Diego Zoo, and all I remember of the kagu exhibit. This was many years ago. Um, and all I remember was of the kagu exhibit. It was I think it was next to the place where you wait for the kind of the tour bus that would take you around the zoo. So you'd line up, and then next to the place where you line up, there was this exhibit, and there was a sign that said there were kagu in the exhibit. Uh, Except it was such a densely planted exhibit that you couldn't really see anything.
Oh, right.
So yeah, I didn't see any kagu on that trip, but I think that's the only place that I've seen that I know have held kagu. Otherwise, yeah, I've certainly never been to New Caledonia, so never seen a kagu in person.
Yeah, me neither. Yeah, I can't think of any zoo I've been to that would have had them.
Right,
So it's fingers crossed. I'm able to see one at some point.
right, yeah, definitely. They're pretty high on my wish list for sure. So I guess one of the weird things about kagu is that they are nearly flightless. Um, but they do still have quite large wings. Um, and mostly they use their wings in part, for display. And this is one of their similarities of the sunbittern because they don't have eye spots on their wings, but their wings do have a kind of bold striped pattern when they're spread. And so also when they are feeling threatened or they want to see off another kagu, they will often spread out their wings and and kind of perform a threat display in that manner. Um, that's definitely one of the most obvious similarities with the sunbittern. Um, and I say nearly flightless on here because it seems that they are actually able to use their wings to cross small obstacles. In fact, if you read a lot of books, or any other kind of medium that writes about kagu, it is often said that they are able to use their wings to glide down hills or whatever. Um, Apparently, it is not certain that this actually happens. So I found a message on the dinosaur mailing list, yeah, which is a mailing list where people get together to discuss dinosaurs. It is not as active as it used to be, but it's still hanging around and people still post on it. But there was a post from, I don't know, maybe the late 2000s or early 2010s, um, where someone said that they spoke to basically the leading field biologist and conservationist who studies kagu and was told that kagu do not in fact use the wings to glide with, but what they'll do is that if they come across, say, a stream, for example, they will actually jump and then flap the wings a few times to get over the stream. So apparently they are able to perform a little bit of limited kind of flight in that manner. And they even mentioned specifically that if the stream is 4 meters wide or less, they are able to, I guess, fly over it in this way. But if it is not, they will kind of plop down in the middle and then have to swim the rest of the way across. Um,
Oh,
yeah.
well, there's that. That's an aquatic. You know.
Yeah, I guess it's somewhat ironic we are starting with sunbittern and kagu in this episode because they are definitely the least aquatically adapted kind of members of this group probably. Yeah, and definitely the kagu is even less kind of tied to aquatic habitats than the sunbittern. Now it does live in fairly humid environments. It lives in like forests, but and they like to eat earthworms and things which they pull up from the leaf litter with their beak. But yeah, they're not specifically tied to water. Sometimes they'll forage for like little fish and tadpoles, I think, in shallow water. But
Hmm.
yeah, otherwise they're kind of like weird island members of this group, so they're kind of off doing their own thing. Um, yeah, in any case, very interesting for several reasons. Well, of course, the evolutionary history I keep mentioning, which we don't know much about, but also kind of the implications for near flight behaviors and maybe even origins of flight. Like, what good are large wings if you can't really fly with them? Well, if you can fly a little bit with them and do some other things with them, well, they could be useful. And the kagu is kind of a living example of that. Um, so yeah, I mentioned that they forage for prey in the ground, basically. Um, and they have a very unusual social structure too. So they mostly live in family groups. And what happens is that usually when the males get to a certain age, a group of brothers will kind of establish a little territory near their parents, um, and then hopefully a dispersing female will come by and join them, and all of the I guess the brotherhood of kagu will mate with that one breeding female, and they'll start a family together, and their offspring will often stick around for a bit to kind of help with taking care of their younger siblings, and defend the territory and things like that. And something that's also quite interesting is that because the male kagu often establish territories near where their parents are, they have been observed actually going back and visiting their parents from time to time. Yeah, like they'll sometimes go back to their parents' territory and just hang out with their parents, hang out with their uncles. Uh, why they do this? We I don't think we know, but it is a very interesting type of behavior, and it's basically otherwise unknown in birds. Like in fact, it's possibly unknown in other animals other than humans. Like I think it's a this kind of social structure is otherwise possibly only seen in humans. So that's definitely very odd.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Wow, it's kind of sweet in a way too.
Yeah,
It's like,
right,
oh,
right. Yeah, yeah. So in Kagu, it is mostly the young females that got dispersed far away from their parental territory, and the males kind of stick around and form these groups of brothers that just mate with a single female, and they all stick together, kind of like that. Um, so yeah, very interesting group. Um, Now let's go on to the next slide, where we'll meet the third lineage in the Phaethontimorphs, which are the tropic birds. Tropic birds are also quite an unusual group. Fortunately, we do have a much better fossil record of tropic birds compared to the other two. We know them from since the Paleocene onwards. In fact, some of the oldest fossils that we can be, pretty confident are neo-avian fossils. Are fossils of early tropic birds. These are fossils from the Paleocene of New Zealand. Um, yeah, we have some fossils of them there. Uh, there are also fossils from the Paleogene of Europe and North Africa, and even Central Asia in one case. So they were quite widely distributed during the Paleogene, which is kind of in contrast to their current day distribution, because in the modern day, there are only three living species of tropic birds, and they're only found in tropical oceans, or rather, it might be more accurate to say over tropical oceans, because they spend most of their time just flying above the ocean. And when they breed, they will find isolated tropical islands where there are no land predators and breed there. They do seem to have a much wider distribution in the past compared to the present, which is a pattern we have seen before in some bird groups, and we will see again in future episodes. But currently, they're only found in kind of equatorial regions, and now that's probably why they're called tropic birds, I guess. Yeah. Now they have a number of quite distinctive features. You can notice immediately here that they have a very long pair of central tail feathers, um, that are quite streamer-like, and these are probably used in display. So their courtship display mostly consists of doing kind of like these aerial displays of kind of various maneuvers in the air, and both the males and females have these streamers. So I guess this might be another example of mutual sexual selection going on, where kind of both sexes are using the using ornaments to judge their mate quality. So probably the streamer like feathers are used for flaunting while they're doing those aerial displays. Um, their feet are what we call totipalmate, and that means they have webbing between all four of their toes, which is pretty unusual, because most birds with webbed feet only have webbing between the three toes that point forward in modern birds. So, of course, most modern birds have a little innermost toe that points backwards called the hallux. You often used for gripping branches and things like that. And usually in most web-footed birds, it's just the three forward-pointing toes, the three main toes, that have webbing between them. But tropic birds have webbing between all four toes, and that's pretty rare. It's pretty much only found otherwise in other members of the big waterbird clade, specifically in pelicans and also in the boobies and the cormorants and the relatives. And that's one of the reasons why tropic birds were once thought to be very close relatives of, the boobies and cormorants et al. That is because of this feature, because they're one of the few other birds that have these toady palmate feet. But we now know that is not the case, and in fact, even back then, people realized that tropic birds were kind of the odd ones out in that group. Like they have a number of other features that are shared in that group are not present in tropic birds. So, in hindsight, it is not super surprising that they turned out to be, not so closely related. Now, even though they have these webbed feet, tropic birds don't swim that much. Now, sometimes they will land on the surface of the water to take a rest, but they don't swim around much. They spend most of their time flying, and they're very good flyers. They're very strong and agile flyers. Their flight style is primarily flapping flight, so they'll kind of flap over the ocean instead of soaring. And if they see a fish that they want to catch, they will plunge down from the sky and grab the fish, and then immediately come back up into the air. So they feed by a plunge diving. And in terms of kind of their maneuverability in the air, they're very agile. And they often have to be because there are other birds in their environment that like to steal fish from them. In fact, we will meet some of them in the next episode. And so, tropic birds will often have to make use of their very good flying skills to try and avoid other birds that are trying to steal their catches. Very, very cool birds. I've never seen tropic birds in person. They're definitely also very high on my wish list. I think they must be amazing to see. But do you have anything else to add about them?
No, I've certainly never seen one in person either. But I know I've seen like film of them, of course.
Yeah, right. In documentaries, yeah.
Very sleek, very swift.
Right.
They're impressive to see, and like to see that in person, I would be amazing.
Yeah, I think so too. I guess something else that's worth mentioning is that their feet are very small in comparison to their body. It's because they have such an aerial lifestyle that they can't really walk on land. If they land, on land, they kind of just flop down on their bellies and they kind of push themselves along, and they'll even use their beak and their wings to kind of help shuffle themselves. So yeah, they're very, very awkward on land. They are definitely most at home, like over the ocean in the air, which is quite an interesting kind of environment to be specialized for. Now, on the next slide, we can talk a little bit about their fossil record, because like I said, we actually have a pretty decent fossil record of tropic birds. And one of the best represented fossil tropic birds, stem tropic birds, is Prophaethon from the Eocene of the United Kingdom. And you can see here some comparisons between Prophaethon and modern tropic bird, and a modern tropic bird. So on the left there, on the letter A is the skull of Prophaethon compared to the skull of a modern tropic bird, and you can see that the beak shape is quite different. It's a bit straighter in Prophaethon, a bit more narrow. It's a bit like the skull of I don't know, like maybe some of the petrels maybe, which we will meet later. Kind of a somewhat straight, moderately long bill that kind of tapers to a point there. So maybe it was feeding differently, we're not sure. We do have some other evidence that a Prophaethon had a different ecology from modern tropic birds, and that's the feet. So I mentioned that tropic birds, modern tropic birds at least, have very small feet. So on the right there is the foot of Prophaethon on the left. compared to a modern tropic bird on the right. The the scale bars are supposed to be equivalent lengths in both for both feet. So if you imagine kind of scaling up the Prophaethon image, so that the scale bar is the same size, you can see that the foot of Prophaethon is quite a bit larger than the foot of a modern tropic bird. And in terms of body size, a Prophaethon was about the same size as a modern tropic bird, so it wasn't like spectacularly bigger or anything like that, but its foot was much longer. And so it seems that Prophaethon might have been a bit more of a swimmer than modern tropic birds. Modern tropic birds don't really swim much, but maybe Prophaethon was spending more time kind of swimming on the surface of the water because it had these larger feet with which it could do that. And if that was the case, then it might make sense why tropic birds have these webbed feet despite not swimming much in modern day, because they might have had ancestors that did. So that's kind of cool. Something else that's different between these stem tropic birds and these modern tropic birds is that we found abundant fossils of stem tropic birds on some coastlines on continents. Like I mentioned, I think North Africa earlier. There's one particular stem tropic bird that is known from many, many specimens in North Africa. And it is possible that there are so many there because they were breeding, forming a breeding colony there. And that is also something that's quite different from modern tropic birds, which prefer to nest in very isolated, kind of insular environments, not on the shorelines of continents. So it may have been that these stem tropic birds were not so specialized for this kind of very open ocean pelagic aerial lifestyle like the modern ones were, and were kind of more just hanging out on the coast and maybe swimming around in the shoreline waters and catching their prey there. But over time they became more specialized until we get the very weird forms that modern tropic birds have taken. Yeah. So do you have anything else to add about tropic birds in general?
Not particularly, no.
Yeah, but it is quite cool that we do have a nice fossil record for them.
Yeah, I definitely I recognize Prophaethon.
Yeah.
I think I had the Eyewitness fossil book
Oh wow.
growing up, and it had this bird featured there. So it's
Oh
like kind
wow.
of like the earliest like fossil Cenozoic birds that I knew about
Right,
growing up.
right. That is pretty cool. And yeah, it definitely is also not Prophaethon specifically, but stem tropic birds are also some of the oldest Cenozoic birds that we can confidently identify in the fossil record as belonging to a specific group. So yeah, they've been around for a while, and have lasted until present day.
Yeah, incredible.
So, I guess with that, we can move on to the other major group of the waterbird clade, the big waterbird clade. We've done the Phaethontimorphs, so we'll do the other group now. And the other group is much more diverse. This is Acornithes with over 300 living species. Now, Acornithes is a very, very diverse group, but pretty much almost all of its members are, specialized for aquatic foraging in some way or another. Um, but they do this in very different ways, and we will explore kind of the many different ways they become aquatic, in this episode and in the next one too. Now, even though they're quite diverse, I don't think it greatly surprised a lot of people that all of these groups formed a clade, because they do have quite a large number of skeletal similarities, and I guess the main question really has been whether or not these were convergent adaptations to a life in water, or if they really are kind of phylogenetic significance. And currently, it does seem well, maybe it's in a way it's both, because they all happen to be aquatic birds, so all these features probably are at least conducive to an aquatic foraging lifestyle, but also because they do all share a last common ancestor that potentially was an aquatic forager, and so inherited these traits from that ancestor. Now, just to name one of the features that most members of the group share, uh, their beak, or rather the keratinous sheath that forms the covering, the beak covering, um, has a prominent nericorn, as we call it. So um, in birds, the keratinous sheath of the beak is actually formed out of several plates. And in a lot of birds, these plates are actually all kind of fused together, they blend into each other, so you can't really tell that they're independent plates anymore. Um, But in a lot of the members of Acornithes, you actually can see the beak formed out of these separate plates. And not only that, but the specific plate called the nericorn is often quite prominent and heavily keratinized in members of Acornithes. So the nericorn is a plate, shown here is a beak of an albatross, or a schematic of the beak of an albatross, and the tip of the beak is towards the right there, the base of the beak is towards the left, and the nericorn is a plate that kind of covers the region behind the nostrils. And that plate tends to be very prominent in Acornithians. In a lot of other birds, the nericorn might not actually be keratinized at all. There might just be kind of a patch of soft skin there, but we do have a very heavily keratinized nericorn in this group. So let's meet some members of this group. So first up, we have a very kind of aquatically specialized group, the Loons. In fact, pretty much all the groups we're going to meet today are heavily kind of aquatic specialized, like heavily specialized for living like in aquatic environments and moving through or over the water. Now, loons have another widely used common name over here in England. They're more commonly called divers. So yeah, quite different kind of terminology there. But since I'm American, I know them as loons, so we're gonna go with loons here. Now, loons are known from the Eocene onward, although their fossil record is not super great, but we do have a number of fossil examples, and I'll show one on the next slide. There are only 5 living species today, but they are distributed all across the northern hemisphere, particularly in the polar and temperate regions. And usually what they do is during the summer, they'll fly out and breed usually on large freshwater lakes. And then during the non-breeding season, they'll fly south usually, and spend their time in coastal marine regions or on other large lakes further south. Now, they are highly specialized for foot-propelled diving. And like the grebes that we mentioned earlier, and also like the Hesperornithians, they are so specialized for foot-propelled diving that they have a hard time moving around on land, and that's because their kind of thigh region is kind of encased in their body, and their hind limbs are also kind of splayed out a little bit to the side. So the thigh is capable of some movement. There are some large muscles attached to it, but it is quite restricted, and because it is encased in the body, and because the thigh is very short, and splayed kind of outward to the sides. What that does is that it allows the feet to be put kind of directly behind the body, so they have a more efficient kind of kick when they're swimming through the water. And because of that, they are extremely good swimmers underwater, very fast swimmers. They can chase after their prey underwater, and swim very well. But they are not so good at moving around on land. So when they're on the land, some of the smaller species of loons can kind of support their weight with their hind limbs and walk a few steps like that. But it's certainly very awkward. And the larger ones, they can barely do that. Like most of the time, they're belly sliding. They are pushing themselves along with their feet and kind of dragging themselves across land. I have heard reports of them traveling like over a kilometer overland this way, so they can be quite persistent if they have to be to travel to another lake or something. But yeah, I imagine it's certainly not a place they like to be very much. And in fact, they are so dependent on the water that they can pretty much only get into flight by running across the surface of the water. And that's because, again, their hind limbs are sticking out so far back on the body, they can't really jump into the air like other birds can. So what they have to do is they have to have a long runway across the water before they can take off. And that's why they live on these big lakes and places like that, other large bodies of water. You're not likely to see loons on just any little pond or anything like that. They need a nice big body of water so they can have a nice kind of runway for them to take off. and also to land as well. I've seen a video of a loon landing on the surface of the water, and like most water birds, and you know most birds in general, but specifically for water birds, when they're landing, they'll of course bring the feet down to touch down on the water, and then they'll kind of slide along with the feet, kind of like as like kind of like skis, I guess, water skis, and then kind of slow down to a stop, skimming across the surface of the water like that. But a loon, because the feet are again, you know, sticking way back out there, it can't bring the feet forward to do that. And what they do is they'll actually just land down with their, you know, chest and their belly, their underside, and just plop down on the surface of the water and then slide along the surface like that. Um, it is quite something to see. I'll see if I can find the video of that, and link it in the description, because it's quite an interesting way of landing. And again, it shows their dependence on water, because doing that kind of landing style on hard ground would be very dangerous. Um, that is also actually a threat to loons, is that they'll sometimes mistake like large patches of, you know, like places like parking lots where the, you know, the ground the ground is very dark. They'll mistake that for a big patch of water and then plop down on top of that. And you know, in a best case scenario, if they don't injure themselves doing that, they can't take off again. So that means they're kind of helpless. They have to push themselves on land in the awkward manner I described earlier. Um, so that's a bit of trouble they sometimes get into.
Oh, that
Um,
sucks.
yeah, right, right. Yeah, and while I'm mentioning that, I guess, you know, one of the things that bothered me most about Finding Dory.
I was I was I was reading your mind because I was about to go
Really?
there myself.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So you know, I liked Finding Dory all right. It was a perfectly decent movie. Like I, you know, obviously Finding Nemo was, you know, a classic, and you know, can very difficult to top. But you know, I thought Finding Dory was fine. But my biggest problem with it is that they had a loon character, and they didn't have her do anything that an actual loon would do. And
Right.
including they showed her walking around on land like some duck, like normally, like a typical bird. And no, loons cannot do that. And yeah, they literally cannot do that. And it's kind of it's kind of frustrating, because you know that particular character was meant to be a sort of comic relief character. And it's like, if you put like the kind of silly loon walk in there, that would have been perfect. It would have been perfectly fit
Oh
in.
yeah.
It would have been perfectly fit in with the kind of tone they were trying to, you know, convey. but but they just had her do like regular bird things, and it's like, loons are such this super weird group. If you're gonna use a loon, you should capitalize on what makes loons so weird. Yeah, so I was not so keen on that. But
Right. It's so out of place because I mean, like that franchise,
right,
like prided itself on, oh, we sent all of our animators and artists to like a marine biology
right,
class, like everything right about the animals for the most part.
yeah, right,
So
right,
kind of like supposedly just skimp all that out on this character that was like interchangeable with like a duck.
right, exactly,
It's like weird. It's like weird. It didn't even look like
exactly.
a loon either. Yeah, it was like the proportions were all off and
Yeah, right. Yeah, like the coloration was loon-like, but that was about it.
right, it was strange.
Right, right. Yeah, indeed, indeed. And I was going to mention that too, because they obviously did do the research with like the fish and things like that. So it's very odd that that they didn't seem to, you know, either didn't do their research on loons, or didn't seem to care about getting the loon right. So yeah, it's very odd. But in any case, yeah, a bit of a tangent there. Would have been a good opportunity to show people how weird loons are, but oh well. So
Oh,
yeah, it's kind of funny. Yeah, we complain a lot about people getting, you know, of course, extinct dinosaurs wrong in like the Jurassic Park franchise, but people can't seem to get the living ones right either.
because like there's like footage and photos like right there.
Right.
You know, 5-second Google search or YouTube loon, and
You're right.
that's all the information you need for the most part.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. It's quite easy to find videos of loons trying to move on land. It's very easy. So yeah, you go ahead and Google loon walking around, and yeah, you will see that they can't for most part.
I feel like I'm like overly familiar with loons.
Yeah,
So like, I've mentioned before, like I've probably mentioned before that I have family in Maine,
right.
and loons are just everywhere there.
Yeah.
Whenever we go, and when we would like rent cabins and stuff near the Belgrade Lakes region, um, there was like no morning that would pass where you get up and everything was all foggy, and you could hear those distinctive calls
Yes.
in the distance. And of course, when you'd go kayaking or paddling or taking the speedboat around, like you could see them fairly easily, and I mean, they're large birds, so like
Yep.
you can't miss them at all.
Right.
Like growing up, I've definitely like become very familiar with them. I mean, even with the family too. Like we all love loons. Like immediately to my right is like a big plastic loon that my folks bought
Oh,
for decor. I think the same species as this one here.
yeah.
And so yeah, like I definitely know these birds very well.
That's great. Yeah, yeah, that's absolutely fantastic. Yeah, I haven't seen loons quite as often. I have seen them before. Back when I was studying in Maryland. They didn't breed there, or at least not in the region that my university was in. But when they were, on their way to their breeding grounds, migrating, I would sometimes see them at a large. There, we had I guess, a park nearby, near the university, where there was this huge lake, a huge man-made lake, um, and oftentimes waterbirds would gather there. And when during the migration season, I would often visit and watch the birds there, and sometimes it would be loons. And yeah, they are quite striking birds. Even though the ones that were around there at the time that I saw them tended to still be in their rather muted kind of a non-breeding plumage, so not quite as striking as the one pictured on here. Um, they they were very distinctive and hard to miss because again they are quite large, and yeah, really cool birds to watch. They are definitely very at home in the water, and yeah, they would, in typical wildlife fashion, as soon as I got my camera ready to take a picture of them, they would, of course, dive underneath the water and
Oh
disappear.
yeah,
And
that's
then,
fun to watch too because it's like
yeah,
where are they gonna pop
where
up?
are they going to pop up? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and they would pop up far away, and you're like, wow, they can swim. Like, yeah, they can swim. Like, they're very good at it.
They've certainly earned the other name diver.
They have, yeah, yeah. In fact, it's probably a more flattering name than Loon, really. Um, I guess somewhere else I know loons from is not from seeing them in person, but also from living in Canada for a little bit. The $1 coin in Canada is called the loonie because there's a loon printed on one side of it. So
I didn't know
yeah, yeah. So yeah, that's cool. And also, I'm glad you mentioned their very distinctive calls because that's also another major presence loons have in pop culture, isn't it? Because yeah, they have this super distinctive kind of wailing noise, or at least that's how it's often described. And I'm not even going to try to mimic it because only a loon can do that noise. But it is definitely distinctive, and I can pretty much guarantee that even if you don't know it, you've heard it before. It's probably somewhere in some movie or something. I think one of the funniest examples, unintentionally funny examples of it, I think is in Infinity War. Um, I think at the very end of Avengers Infinity War, when Thanos is kind of settling down on his planet, and you can hear a loon in the background.
Oh, that's right.
It's
I
like,
get it.
oh,
It's one of those like stock animal sounds, like
right,
like a swampy, like mysterious land. You
right.
throw a loon call in there.
You're right, right.
Um, yeah,
Yep.
um, oh my gosh, I could try. Uh, woo!
Yeah, yeah, not bad, not bad. Something like that, yeah.
Maybe I mean I would imagine that's probably where they got like the name loon.
Right.
'Cause if you I guess if you tweak it in a way like it kind of sounds like loon,
It could be,
or
yeah, yeah.
maybe use and it's like oh my gosh, 'cause, I mean, like yeah, like Looney Tunes. I mean,
Right.
when Daffy would go nuts, he'd make like loon noises.
True.
Woo,
Yeah.
woo! I'm sure there's some like etymology stuff there that I'd have to dig into.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, it's certainly a possibility. But yes. So yeah. Quite an unexpected. I would say quite a large presence and sometimes unexpected presence in pop culture. Um, Very good swimmers and divers. And once they actually get into the air, they're very good flyers. They can fly very fast for long distances. Um, but yeah, the trick is that, well, they need water to do anything they need to do. So, and large bodies of water. So yeah, not too good at getting around on land, but they are very good at what they are good at doing.
I'm actually very curious. Since I'm sure like, I'm not the only one who's thought this before.
Yeah,
Do loons make good analogs in part
yeah.
for spornithines?
To a point, yeah, probably. They certainly seem to have had very similar types of a hind limb musculature. People have tried to try to reconstruct the hind limb musculature of Hesperornis, and it does seem to have been quite loon-like in that respect. Um, and But it also has some similarities with grebes as well. So there's a lot of kind of convergence going on in these super specialized diving birds. Um, there was also a study that kind of looked at what we call morphometrics. So looking at the shapes of, I think they look mostly at the bones in this case. So shapes of the bones and trying to quantify, similarity between different birds. And they found that they weren't quite as similar in terms of the shapes and proportions of the bones as they might have expected. So Hesperornis and Loons were not as similar as they might have expected. Instead, they found that cormorants instead might have been more comparable to Hesperornis in some ways. Um,
Oh,
so yeah, so they do definitely have some convergent adaptations with Loons, but yeah, it's possible that in some other ways of their function, they might not have been so similar. So it's one of those things where yeah, it definitely you can look at loons as an analog, but you don't take it too far, I guess.
oh, right. Well, see, yeah, of course, like, loons can fly, so
Right, right. Yeah, that's a pretty big difference there.
and I know like loons can at least like some loons can like walk like a little bit on land.
Right, right, yeah, yeah. They did suggest in that paper, since of course cormorants can walk on land, that maybe a number of the Hesperornithians could too. But they did also say that in the very biggest ones, the things like Hesperornis, the legs were just so far back on the body, and the hind limbs were the upper hind limb, the femur was so short compared to the rest of the hind limb that they probably wouldn't have been able to balance that way, and probably really were kind of loon-like in terms of only being able to belly slide on land.
Right. I
Yeah.
remember seeing a Burrian illustration,
Hmm.
and it's so striking me. Like they're trying to compromise this whole, like they can't probably like stand or walk on land like
Uh-huh.
most other birds by like giving them like a scaly belly
Oh yeah.
on their chest to just kind of drag around in, so the feathers don't get damaged. Or I guess
Right, right. Yeah, it's certainly an interesting idea. I guess as we shall see, in things like penguins, penguins of course haven't re-evolved scales on the belly, but they do have quite scale-like feathers, and which interestingly seem adapted for shedding ice and snow, so they help them belly slide. So of course, probably in most cases, Hesperornithians weren't living in very icy environments, unlike penguins. But
right.
maybe they had some kind of adaptation um, for kind of belly sliding on land, especially since they don't have to fly anymore and be all that aerodynamic. So I wonder.
The mysteries of extinct birds.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe someday we'll find some preserved with feathers. There's a specimen of a Parahesperornis that has been claimed to preserve feathers with it along the hind limb, But there was a more recent paper that looked at that specimen in more detail, and we're like, yeah, we're not really seeing anything there. So, yeah,
Oh,
maybe the feathers were originally there and kind of just wore away over time, or they were just people seeing things that weren't there. We don't know. Yeah, quite unfortunate that they couldn't confirm it.
maybe they go the primeval route, just like completely naked.
Oh God. Yeah, that would be something, wouldn't it?
Well,
But
of course,
yeah,
like they could talk about that.
right.
That is an interesting point. Like I can't think of. Well, of course, I mean we maybe the false is not the best place to test this, but
Mhm.
like I can't think of any single like aquatic bird that just like gave up its feathers to like make it easier to live in the water somehow.
Yeah, no, I can't think of any. Yeah.
It's like even whales have like hair here and there on their
Mhm.
bodies, so
Right.
they're not completely new in
Right.
that sense. So, gosh, yeah, that would be weird.
Yeah. Right, yeah. I mean, looking at living water birds, yeah, I think it's quite unlikely, but who knows?
Sure.
I know people have pointed out that Hesperornis specifically, and not other Hesperornithians, but Hesperornis specifically, has this really weird pygostyle, so the fused vertebrae at the end of the tail are a very unusual shape. And the vertebrae there are a very unusual shape, and it seems like it was probably supporting something. So people have
Oh,
suggested that maybe it was supporting like this big paddle-like fan of tail feathers, um, which we actually see in
ooh.
some of the water birds today, like anghingas, have this very long, well-developed tail feathers that they use kind of as a rudder in the water. So that could be indirect evidence that they did retain feathers, but yeah, it's hard to say. Um,
That'd be kind of cool to see in a reconstruction.
yeah, definitely.
Spoiled with like because every illustration I've seen with Hesperornis kind of gives it like a nubbin
Right. Yeah,
tail.
people assume that there weren't big feathers there, but yeah, it's got that weird tail, so maybe it did. It had like this kind of almost beaver-like kind of arrangement, or
Oh,
rather, an
that's really
arrangement of tail feathers that was superficially a beaver-like tail. Yeah, I know. Matt Martignac in his book, A Field Guide to Mesozoic Birds and Other Winged Dinosaurs, which is an amazing book, and everybody should check it out. It's the wonderful illustrations of all these Mesozoic birds and bird-like dinosaurs. Um, he does mention that this feature, and he does give his Hesperornis a fairly kind of large tail feathers. So that's one example where I've seen it. But yeah, I think a lot of time people just assume, oh, it's a flightless bird, we'll just give it a stub tail and again be done with it.
right. Oh, that's neat. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty cool. But yeah, in any case, Hesperornithiforms are stem birds and should not be in this in this series. So we're gonna
Right. We give him too much time to them.
yeah. Yeah, sorry, but you guys are cool. But this is a bird. This is a series about crown birds. So,
Yeah, maybe survive to the present day, and then we'll talk.
right, right. So yeah, let's look at some fossil loons, or at least one particular fossil loon on the next slide. Um, and this is Columboides from the Oligocene of Germany, or one of the species that has been referred to Columboides, although it's not clear if it really does belong to Columboides, so that's why the question mark is there. Um, and it's a rather scattered kind of skeleton, but a lot of the major bones are there. In the upper right, you can see the tips of the beaks. They're labeled BE in the figure, in the schematic to the right. Um, Quite a lot of the forelimb bones are there. The long bones that are kind of scattered to the right are mostly forelimb bones, wing bones. The femur is there as well. The femur is very short. It's labeled FE. You can see how short it is. That's a very diving bird feature. The rest of the hind limb, or at least the foot, is kind of displaced down towards the bottom right there. That's a foot with the tarsometatarsus, so long bones of the foot fused together, and the various bones from the toes scattered around. Um, and off to the left, labeled STE, that's the sternum or the breastbone. And there's a bit of the hip down kind of underneath it as well. So yeah, quite a bit of the skeleton is there. Something else is interesting about this skeleton is that it has stomach contents preserved, labeled STO, or some scattered fish remains that are associated with the skeleton.
Oh,
So
cool.
this early loon was hunting and catching fish like the modern ones would. Yeah, in terms of the general skeleton, these stem loons seem to have been mostly similar to modern loons. We haven't found a stem loon that is clearly doing something different yet. But we also really don't have a lot of like very early loon skeletons from like the Eocene or before then. So yeah, we're still missing that part of the record. Now, something that is quite interesting about these fossil loons is that, first of all, they tend to be much smaller than the living loons. Um, and also, they can be found in environments that were, at the time, tropical, which is very unusual because modern loons are restricted to relatively cool environments, the temperate and polar kind of habitats. But apparently, in the past, there were loons that were living in very warm environments too. So that's quite unusual. In fact, there are some fossil loons that have been found kind of associated with teeth of crocodiles buried in their bones. So yeah, they were getting eaten by crocodiles, either hunted or scavenged. We don't know. Um, and that's definitely kind of two different groups of animals that normally probably would not really meet that often in present day, but we have evidence of interaction in the fossil record. Yeah, so that's about all I have to say for fossil loons. Do you have anything else to add before we move on?
No, not that I've said already.
Okay, cool. So let's go on to the next group, and these are the penguins, and these are definitely one of the most specialized marine dinosaurs of all, to say the
Oh yeah.
least. Yeah. Now, penguins are very popular. Everybody loves penguins. But I think that the general image we have of penguin is in some ways quite at odds with what they're actually like in life. Because we think of penguins as these kind of, really funny, really silly animals. And I think part of the reason for that is, primarily we see penguins when they're out on land. And when they're out on land is when they're breeding, so they have to be on land, and when they're molting. And that's usually when people are, filming documentaries about it. And that's when, that's how we see them in zoos because of course they do have a room to swim in zoos, ideally, but they are given space on land for them to rest, and so you don't really see just how aquatically specialized they are. And in truth, the penguins are very powerful aquatic predators that spend most of their lives at sea, often for months on end without returning to land at all. Um, and they are quite capable of giving us rather solid account of themselves, you could say. Because we spoke about this a little bit in the previous episode when I was talking about skuas, but unlike typical birds, penguins don't have to be light, right? Because they don't fly anymore. So their bones are very dense compared to other birds and have very thick bone walls, not hollow. So even though they do have air sacs like all other birds do, but their air sacs do not invade their bones. They do not extend deep inside their bones, which are why bird bones are hollow or filled with air, is because of the air sac space. And this is actually an adaptation we see in some other diving birds too. So the grebes and the loons, for example, they also don't have a pneumatic, what we call pneumatic skeletons. They don't have these hollow spaces in the bones for the air sacs because they need to be, somewhat less buoyant to dive under the water. And of course, in penguins, this is very extreme. So they have very dense bones, very solid bones. So for their size, they weigh quite a lot compared to other birds that look like they're around the same size as they are. And yeah, they can be quite feisty. If you make a penguin mad, it can easily strike at you with its bill or smack you with its flipper. And its flipper is used for propelling itself through the water. It's filled with those very dense bones, so being hit by one, I think would probably hurt. Yeah. Um,
I'm sorry. I'm just reminded of that GIF. I forget who,
yeah.
but the penguin just walking and the one's just standing there and just slaps it in the water.
Yeah, I think that one. I think that one's like a CGI or something, or at least the part about it hitting the other one. But
Oh yeah.
Nonetheless, nonetheless, yeah, penguin flipper smack is not to be sneezed at. I think we mentioned last time that a skua, even though you see them going after baby penguins all the time in documentaries and in films, they would not want to mess with an adult penguin because an adult penguin outweighs them by a lot and could smack them into something unrecognizable if they actually got hold of them. So yeah, they have to be pretty careful when they're trying to catch baby penguins. Um, I really like the description that Katrina Van Grau gives penguins in her book, The Unfeathered Bird, and I unfortunately don't have my copy of the book with me, so I can't read off it. But basically, it goes to paraphrase, it goes something like, penguins look silly on land, but they're not really a group that we need to pity because they are actually superbly adapted to their environment. They are very well adapted to life out at sea and even on the land. They can get around well enough to get by. They have very large claws on their feet for gripping slippery rocks and ice and things. And I've seen them in documentaries. Like jumping on rocks and ice and trying to make their way onto land, and they can get quite battered doing so because of big waves and things, and they slip, and but they keep trying, and eventually they will make their way up there, come hell or high water. So yeah, they are actually quite impressive and quite tough birds. um in fact, that also reminds me of another nature documentary sequence that I've seen. I think it is from the original Planet Earth. Um, so it is king penguins coming back to their nesting grounds after fishing. And then there are these fur seals that are hanging around on the beach that will come after them when they're when they're coming back. So the fur seals, they will actually chase after them and try to kill them and eat them. And if you weren't aware, fur seals are not like earless seals. So there's a distinction between eared seals and earless seals, and the ones with kind of ear flaps and the ones that don't. And earless seals are pretty clumsy on land. They basically wiggle around like giant worms almost. They can't really get around much, right? But eared seals, which include the sea lions and the fur seals, they can actually run on land. And so, obviously they can't run as well as, say, a wolf or some other land dwelling mammalian predator could, but they can run and can get quite a bit of pick up quite a bit of speed doing it. And so you see these seals get chasing after penguins, and it's actually kind of scary to watch. Um, and when the penguins that turn their backs on the fur seals, a lot of them get grabbed by the neck, and you see them get shaped and killed. It's quite brutal, and it's not a easy watching really.
Mm.
But we also then it also cuts to several scenes where the penguins actually turn around and face off against the fur seals, and the penguins are vastly outweighed by the fur seals, but the seal does not want to get hurt. It doesn't want cuts in its face, or doesn't want to lose an eye from getting poked in the eye by a penguin. So they are much more cautious when they come up against penguins that turn around to face them. And so one of the penguins that does so, it does that for a bit. They have a standoff, and the penguin kind of jabs at the seal several times. Eventually, it manages to find an opportunity to turn around and make a run for it, and then it manages eventually to escape from the seal that way. So yeah, penguins, they can take care of themselves pretty well. Yeah, I've also said this before, but if you have a harpoon attached to your face and you have baseball bats for arms, you're in a pretty good shape to defend for yourself. Yeah.
Perfect.
Right. So yeah, penguins are definitely a very interesting group. Um, Now, a lot of the time when I'm talking about all these different groups, I'll say we don't know much about their fossil record, and that is completely not true for penguins. There is a lot to say about the penguin fossil record. We have a very good fossil record for penguins, and that's almost certainly because they are because of those dense bones that preserve very well, and they live in marine environments, which are often depositional environments where fossils are being formed. So that combination of factors mean that we actually have a really good penguin fossil record. So there will be several slides coming up talking about fossil record of penguins. But before that, let's go through some of the general penguin features. Um, there are currently 18 recognized living species of penguin, although depending on how you split them, there might be a few more. Penguins are limited to southern hemisphere oceans, but not limited only to cold climates. There are certainly quite a number of penguins that breed near Antarctica and on Antarctica, but they are not limited to Antarctica. Penguins can also be found in South America, in Africa, in Australia, and New Zealand. So they are quite widespread. And the furthermost north they get, they technically do get a little bit over the equator, so they can be found in the Galapagos Islands, so they can kind of venture a little bit over the equator there. And of course, that is a very tropical kind of environment that they're living in there. So yeah, they can be found in very warm environments too. However, that being said, they do depend on cold ocean currents. And so the places, even in the very warm regions where they're found, is where there are these ocean currents, and often with these what we call upwellings. So these upwellings of cold ocean water bringing nutrients down from the deep sea up onto the surface. And these are regions of the ocean that tend to be super biodiverse because, of course, these nutrient-rich waters, of course, allow for a very extensive base of the food chain to form. Lots of little plankton hanging out there feeding on those nutrients. Of course, bigger animals feeding on the plankton and bigger ones still eating them. And so these are very, very biodiverse regions, and the penguins are quite dependent on these cold ocean currents to sustain them. So yeah, so they're not limited to cold climates, but they do need these cold ocean currents. And in part for this reason, a lot of penguins are quite of conservation concern. So of course they can protect themselves pretty well against predators, but they are under threat from anthropogenic activities because climate change, ongoing climate change, is likely to disrupt a lot of these cold currents. And change the flow of nutrients in the oceans. And so places that are currently nutrient rich now might not be so much anymore in the near future. And that's going to put penguins and a lot of local predators in trouble. And of course, there are emperor penguins that breed on Antarctic sea ice. And if there's a global warming, there's not going to be so much sea ice left for them to breed on, and that's going to be problematic too. So definitely penguins are of great conservation concern, and a lot of people are working hard to keep an eye on them and make sure we don't lose many more. Now, in terms of recently extinct species of penguins, there are a few, but we actually didn't know much about them until quite recently. So in New Zealand, there have been a couple of recently described species of penguins that probably died out in the last several centuries or so, but we didn't realize they were there. There were no actual records of them. So we discovered them by analyzing genetics of these ancient penguin bones, and found that these are distinct species from the ones that we have living today. So there is one that is closely related to the yellow-eyed penguin, which currently lives in New Zealand. There used to be an extinct species that did. And another is one of the crested penguin species. So this was a close relative of the macaroni and rockhopper penguin. So these penguins have these very distinctive kind of yellow tufts above their eyes. And so there was another one of those that once lived in New Zealand, but is currently extinct. Or it is extinct, rather. An interesting discovery related to this, it turns out that the modern day, or the extant, yellow-eyed penguin did not always live in New Zealand. It turns out it used to be, that other extinct species that was living in New Zealand, and it seems that it was only quite recently that the modern species of yellow-eyed penguin actually colonized New Zealand after the extinction of its close relative. The yellow-eyed penguin is one of the most endangered species of penguins alive today. it was, until it colonized New Zealand, it probably mostly lived in on sub-Antarctic islands even further south, and it's still found on those islands today. But nonetheless, it has a very restricted kind of distribution, and probably part of the reason why it is in trouble currently is because it only colonized New Zealand quite recently, so it's not completely exactly adapted to the environment there yet, and so if it faces a lot of anthropogenic pressures, it could easily go extinct, and that's why people are quite concerned about it. Other than those rather interesting, quite recent discoveries, we don't know of many recently extinct penguins, and so hopefully we can keep it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. All extant penguins that we know of are flightless, of course. Everybody, I would assume everybody knows that already. So yeah, we talked before about how there's this kind of trade-off between swimming underwater using your wings and flying in through the air. So penguins, of course, use their wings for wing-propelled diving. So they're flying, but they're flying through the water. But a wing that's good for flying through the water is not so good for flying through the air. And so they've kind of ditched the flying through the air part and just become completely flightless, dedicated divers. And of course, once they gave up flight, they don't have to be light anymore, so they can have these very dense bone walls to make them even better divers. And so, yeah, they are very well adapted to that kind of a lifestyle. Um, Penguin feathers are quite interesting. I briefly mentioned that earlier. They are kind of scale-like, so they're kind of short and round. Uh, and of course, they don't need to be very aerodynamic. Um, and something else interesting about them is they're kind of distributed across the body. In most birds, the feathers actually come out what we call feather tracts. So there are these regions of the skin that where the feathers grow out of, and they're arranged in kind of like rows or lines and things like that. So the feathers are not uniformly distributed across the entire skin covering of a bird in most cases, but in penguins they don't have these kind of distinct kind of regions of the skin where specifically the feathers are sprouting out of. Instead, the feathers are a lot more evenly distributed across the body, which is pretty weird. But yeah, of course, they're very densely packed for insulation purposes, so very effective for the often cold environments where they live in. And even the ones that don't live in cold environments, of course, go for a dip in the and even spend a lot of their lives in cold ocean waters. So definitely having good insulation is helpful there. Yeah, we will take a look at some fossil penguins next. But before that, do you have anything to add about penguins in general?
Oh, I mean, I think just to kind of echo our earlier comments, I mean,
Mm.
like their pop culture presence is
Mm.
certainly extensive. I remember there was that period in the 2000s where like every movie studio was doing something with penguins.
Right.
It was like, yeah, Happy Feet,
Yep.
Surf's Up,
Yep.
March of the Penguins,
Yeah.
Farce of the Penguins, but we don't have to talk about that one. Um, oh my god, yeah, yeah, I mean, there's so much I could say about penguins and like they're so many like childhood stories too. Like my sister had to do a project
Hmm.
in high school about an endangered species,
Oh
and
yeah.
she chose the Galapagos penguin
Ah, nice.
incident. And I don't know how she picked it, but it became like a family trope because for many years, like her one of her goals was to like make sure that nothing bad happened to the Galapagos penguin,
Wow.
which was very very sweet.
Yeah, indeed.
And then of course, like quite recently too, I remember me and mom were watching Dynasties,
Hmm. Yeah,
the
right.
well-known recent documentary
Hmm.
about the I don't know, social species the right word?
Yeah. Well,
Tigers.
other than the tiger, yeah, but yeah, but basically fairly well known kind of species and kind of documenting like the specific events in the lives of a specific individual or group of individuals. Um, yeah, interesting format.
Yeah, and very effective too.
Hmm.
Because I mean, they had the Emperor Penguin episode,
That's
and
right.
you don't have to give your penguins like fun voices and cute names and make them dance to get like an emotional response to them. Because
Yeah.
my goodness, we were both like in tears watching these penguins like live out their lives,
Hmm.
and oh, just I I think back on it now, and I just like, ugh, it just kind of fills me with like emotions.
Right, right.
So like there was the whole because I mean, well, for one thing, there's the whole aspect of the emperor penguin where
Mm-hmm.
all the females go out into the ocean during the winter months
Right.
to feed, and then all the males are there with the eggs just huddling together and
That's
just
right.
riding it out, and just constant blizzards and cold and like
Yep.
just disgusting conditions, and like they get through all of that only for like the moms to come back and like I guess it's a thing with emperor penguins where like there's like specific calls that they have to
Yeah, that's right.
like between the babies and the parents that like they can pick out their so that way they can pick out their baby in like
Mm.
the huge, you know, um, crowd, if you will,
Yeah, right.
as it's like exiting the egg and stuff. And like occasionally, like they'll have moms that come back and like the egg just didn't survive, or because
Yeah, right, right.
the embryo froze, or like the egg was lost somehow, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so like they would, I don't know if jealous is the right word. Like their maternal instinct would be so strong that they would like actively try to like take other parents' eggs
That's right. Yeah.
chicks and like raise them for their own. And then of course there's squabbles, and then you see like the babies getting crushed during these fights. So then everybody loses,
Right.
and and then like to get through all of that to like the usual childhood development, like
Right.
penguin colony and like overcoming obstacles and stuff. And it's just yeah, they are just incredible animals,
Mm-hmm.
and I could go on and on about that.
For sure. Yeah, yeah. Like, yeah, it would be really easy to do an entire episode or possibly even an entire series on just penguins in the format we've been doing it here. Um, yeah, there's so much to say about them. And of course, if you throw in the fossil record too, there's definitely a lot to say about that, as we'll see soon.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, the penguin episode was definitely one of my favorite ones from Dynasties. There's definitely a lot that could be said about breeding behavior, reproductive behaviors in penguins, but it's pretty difficult to generalize because the different species they all tend to have do things a little bit differently. So yeah, so that yeah, I guess I don't have time to go into all of that now. And they spend quite a lot of time out at sea and pretty much only come back to lay their eggs, rear their young, and molt. And then when the young are old enough, they go to the sea and just spend a lot of time there until they're old enough to breed themselves. Um, yeah, some of the emperor and king penguins are some of the most marine penguins in terms of like spending time out in the open ocean. But I think in terms of spending the most time at sea, that goes to the Eudyptes penguins, which are the crested penguins, the macaroni and rockhoppers. I think they spend about like 6 months at sea every year, continuously. And what happens is that by the time they get back, by the time they get back to their breeding grounds, uh, the females have already started kind of developing eggs in their body, but because they kind of need to keep up their strength to be able to swim and hunt out at sea, right? So the first egg that they lay is very, very small, and it almost never survives, basically. And instead, it is always the second bigger egg that arrives after they've arrived at the breeding grounds that actually hatches into a chick that they can rear. So that's a very unusual kind of behavior. Um, and so it seems that it's a kind of holdover from ancestors that laid 2 eggs per clutch, but they have a lifestyle that causes one of those eggs to not be able to actually successfully survive anymore, which is very odd.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess like it's like in general like popular culture about birds, like you're kind of used to them like laying like a big clutch of eggs
Right.
and there's all little babies running around. But like for penguins, and now I'm thinking about it, like albatrosses and stuff
Hmm.
too. Like
We'll get to them later.
yeah, like they have like one or two kids.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. Few at once. So yeah, these large seabirds they tend to be very and some not so large ones too. They tend to be very what we call K-selected organisms, which means that they put a lot of investment into a very small number of offspring. So a bit like a human strategy. Um, So they tend to rear only one or two young at a time and spend a lot of time doting over it and rearing it to an age where it is finally able to become independent. And they tend to be very long-lived, so they can rear quite a few young in their lifetime. But each one, they only get one shot, basically, every breeding season, which at least that's often the case. Um, so yeah, animals like that, they can be quite vulnerable to large disturbances. If something is happening to the adults, if nothing's happening to them, it's all good because they can live a long time and rear plenty of young. But if there's additional threats that they are facing, then that can be quite problematic because their breeding rate is so low. And we will see that also with the albatrosses and petrels and their relatives. But first off, we have fossil penguins. So let's go to the next slide. So like I said earlier, penguins have a very, very rich kind of fossil record. So we know a lot about penguin evolution, like way too much to easily dive into all the details here. But I'll hopefully give a quick overview of some of the fossil material that we have and what we can infer from them. So first up, on this slide here, I've given some examples of fossil crown penguins. So these are penguins that belong to the modern group of penguins. They descended from the last common ancestor of all modern penguins. And so these penguins are more closely related to some modern penguins than to other ones. And we have quite a lot of representatives, fossil crown penguins. We have, I think, representatives from nearly every major kind of living penguin lineage known to us from the fossil record. So here are just a few examples, and in some ways, in some cases, they are quite different from their closest living relatives, despite all being crown penguins. In the top left is Madrinornis from the Miocene of Argentina. I think it is one of the oldest crown penguins that we know of. It is known for quite a complete skeleton, as you can see. So the skull is over there to the left, and you can see the rest of the skeleton kind of stretching out behind it. Quite a nice specimen. Depending on the analysis, it is sometimes found to be most closely related to the Eudyptes penguins, so the crested penguins, macaroni and rockhoppers, or to the Spheniscus penguins, which are the banded penguins. So those are like the African penguins and Magellanic penguins of South America and the Galapagos penguin. And there's one more, the Humboldt penguin, also from South America. So they have one living species in Africa, three in South America. So depending on the analysis, Madrinornis comes out as either a close relative of Eudyptes or Spheniscus. So I guess we're still a little bit unsure on that one. But either way, it seems to be a crown penguin. There are some fossil crown penguins that have been assigned to living genera. So that is the case for Eudyptes atatu from the Pliocene of New Zealand down there. And so, of course, it is a member of the same genus as the macaroni and rockhopper Eudyptes penguins. Is known from some pretty good fossils. We know of several specimens, including a partial skeleton, which is pictured here on the right. So there's a big jumble of bones. There is a partial skeleton. There are also parts of the skull, and we have several individuals that preserve skull material, including the lower jaw, which is on the top left there. On the lower left shows the top of the skull. Eudyptes atatu had quite a narrower, kind of shorter beak compared to the modern members of Eudyptes. If you look at a modern rockhopper or macaroni penguin, you can see that the beak is quite tall. It has been suggested that they have such a tall beak because it gives them more room for a more muscular tongue, which they use to catch krill with. So they'll use their spiny tongues. Yeah, penguins have spiny tongues to kind of grab krill in the water and then pin it to the top of their mouth, and so they can grab it more easily. So because Eudyptes atatu doesn't have quite this very tall beak, as a kind of shorter, narrower one, it might not have been feeding on krill so much as the modern species do. So a bit of interesting ecological differences there. And then we have on the right here, I've pictured a Spheniscus urbani, which is pictured in comparison to a modern Spheniscus penguin, which is of course one of his closest living relatives. So the bones that are the white-looking bones are the modern Spheniscus penguin, and they are to scale. So you can see that Spheniscus urbani has a much bigger skull than a modern Spheniscus penguin, and not only that, but it has a very large, massive, and strongly hooked bill as well, which is very striking. We're not entirely sure why it had this big bill, but it is quite reasonable to speculate that maybe it was hunting larger prey than modern penguins do. Maybe going after a particularly large fish it would use to grab, or it would use its bill to grab and then tear them apart. Yeah, probably quite an impressive looking animal in life. And there is another species of Spheniscus also from the Miocene of South America called Spheniscus megaramphus, which is very similar in terms of having a very large bill. In fact, megaramphus basically means big beak, and it was even bigger. It was even bigger than Spheniscus urbani. So yeah, we had these big-headed penguins, hook-billed big-headed penguins around in the Miocene of South America. Pretty cool. Now, these are some examples of fossil crown penguins. But if we go into stem penguins, the penguins that are, the fossils that are more closely related to penguins than to anything else alive today, but do not belong to the modern group of penguins. If we look over there on the next slide, we can see even more diversity there. Now, first of all, something striking about this is that a lot of these fossil stem penguins are massive. They are huge. Yeah, we had this whole series of giant penguins that were around, mostly during the Paleogene. There are a few giant penguin fossils that seem to get up into the early Miocene, I think, but yeah, not many. They seem to have been on their way out by then, for reasons that are uncertain. But I might mention a few possibilities in a moment. Yeah, something else I should mention is that this image was kindly contributed by our friend Ilari, who is a paleo artist and also a fellow enthusiast of fossil birds and birds in general too. And he draws these wonderful images of restorations of fossil birds and bird-like dinosaurs. And yeah, you should all go check out his gallery. He is one of the listeners of this show, and when he heard that this next episode would be about penguins, he was like, "Hey, I drew a bunch of penguins. Can I help?" So I was like, "Yes, of course. I love your art." Yeah, I borrowed a few art pieces from him with his permission, and in addition, he was also kind enough to discuss with me kind of some of the main subjects about penguin evolution that I should cover, because he did his undergraduate thesis on penguin evolution. So yeah, he's definitely a good guy to ask about that subject. Yeah, definitely this episode could not have been made without in this form without his suggestions and his artwork. So definitely thanks a lot, Ilari.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
Definitely. So this is, of course, one of his artworks showing some of the stem penguins in comparison to human. And yeah, you can see that some of these penguins get pretty damn big. So on the furthermost right is a modern penguin. That's not a fossil penguin. That is an emperor penguin. So it's the biggest penguin alive today. And they get to be about 90 centimeters tall, which is pretty big for a bird. But definitely not quite as big as some of these fossil stem penguins. So far, the biggest one that we know of is Paleudiptes klakowski, which is pictured in the middle there, from the Eocene of Antarctica. So there are some somewhat limited remains of the species that seem to suggest that it could grow to something like 2 meters tall, which is ridiculous. Yeah, yeah. What a sight these giant penguins would have been. Now, giant penguins, it seems in most analyses they don't form a clade. In many analyses, they actually seem to form kind of a series that is kind of successively closer to the modern penguins. So it's very plausible that modern penguins actually descended from these giant ancestors. That these giant penguins may not have been just a side branch, or at least not all of them were, of penguin evolution. With the hindsight of present day, obviously, like at the time, nothing was a side branch. But in the hindsight of present day, they might not have been just a side branch to the modern penguins, but might have actually been on the direct line of descent to modern penguins. So that would quite a tantalizing possibility and would be quite interesting. But we do know of some Paleogene penguins that were, not quite so big. There are a few pictured here, like Delphinornis was quite a small genus of penguins. So yeah, very diverse in any case, in the Paleogene. Now, I mentioned that after the early Miocene or so, we don't see giant penguins anymore, and there's of course a question of what happened to them? Why aren't there giant penguins anymore? Um, well, it's debated, but a rather popular hypothesis is that it was the influence of marine mammals. So when you get to the Miocene, you start seeing big diversifications in the pinnipeds, so the seals and sea lions and the relatives, and also in toothed whales. And of course, these are the groups that compete with penguins and sometimes prey on penguins today. And so it could have been that these great diversifications of marine mammals are putting pressure on the giant penguins, maybe feeding on the same types of food. In the case of the pinnipeds, maybe they were competing for net or breeding grounds because, like seabirds, pinnipeds have to return to the land to breed, unlike whales. Um, maybe some of these marine mammals are directly preying on giant penguins, and perhaps being smaller would have allowed them to be more agile and make it easier for them to escape. We don't know. Um, but in any case, yeah, we don't see giant penguins after a certain point in Cenozoic history, and all we have left are the penguins that can get pretty big, but not quite so big today. So yeah.
Mhm.
Now, in addition to size, these giant penguins differed from modern penguins in some other features too. So on the next slide, I show the skull of Ichthyosaurs, which is one of the best preserved giant penguins that we have fossils of. Um, and you can see that the bill is super long, much longer than the rest of the skull, very long and spear-like. And from that description, you might be able to guess what we think that this bill might have been used for. In fact, we also know of these that these large penguins had adaptations in the neck that seem to have been useful for shooting the head kind of forward. So it seems that these penguins hunted in a very different way from modern penguins. Modern penguins tend to catch their prey by biting. As I mentioned, like Eudyptes catching krill by using the tongue and trapping the prey with the mouth. Yeah, but it seems that these giant penguins were mostly stabbing or harpooning their prey with their really, really long beaks and probably going after large fish, things like that. Um, yeah, what a sight that would have been to see. And I gotta say, giant human-sized penguin with the face of a heron is not a bird I would want to get very close to. Like, like,
Not at all.
yeah. Right, we already mentioned earlier, like a living penguin smacking you would hurt, and biting you would probably hurt. Like, uh, giant penguin, like almost as tall as you are or taller, like hitting you, or even worse, potentially even worse, like deciding to stab you with a giant harpoon attached to its face. Yeah, I would love to see a living giant penguin, but definitely from a safe distance.
Oh yeah. No, I turned you into mush.
You're right, right.
That is just to think about that sort of thing. I mean, it is a curious hypothesis that these birds may have been outcompeted by dolphins and seals and stuff.
Mhm.
But yeah, I guess it's a question of like defense against new predators in an environment. Like
Right.
for how terrifying these birds must have been in life. I guess if that was the case, then
Hmm.
that just would not have been enough against a mouthful of teeth.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, it it could have been a lot of things. Like, it doesn't have to be that they couldn't stand up to them in direct conflict, but it could just have been being unfamiliar with that type of predator and not having evolved any defenses against them, or it could be that uh, the juveniles were being preyed on too often for their populations to be replaced. It could have been like
Right.
I mentioned earlier that being so big that maybe they couldn't maneuver in the water around quick enough to escape as effectively from predators. Yeah, it's hard to say. We're talking about a penguin that can probably make a very good account of itself on land, but you know, we have to remember that they were probably spending a lot of their lives in the water, and it might have been harder to fight something in the water. Have you tried punching something underwater? Like,
Oh
yeah,
yeah,
right,
a shark attack, the trope.
right, right.
Yeah, that's a fair point too.
Yeah, yeah,
Which
like
it makes you where where these birds would have been may have gone had
right, right.
like
Yeah.
locations not happened. Would we have giant whale-sized penguins?
Yeah, right, right. Yeah, how could they have evolved if they had continued to retain their giant size and potentially get even bigger? Yeah, that's a good question. But yeah, still, modern penguins are pretty damn cool. The on the next slide, I think I mentioned, yeah, another difference, at least in some of these giant penguins that we know of. So this is Incayacu from the Eocene of Peru, and it's also known for a very well preserved skeleton that is like quite complete. And something really special about Incayacu is that it actually preserves the feathers, which is quite rare in penguin fossils. Um, and so they're pictured here. So this is a part of the wing skeleton of Inkayaku, and you can see kind of the dark streaks below. Those are the feathers, and there are some close-ups of the feathers on to either side too. And some of these close-ups are not just of the feathers themselves, but of the melanosomes preserved in the feathers. And so these are kind of the pigment-containing organelles in the feathers. And we know that they can be preserved in exceptional cases where the skin covering is preserved. They're often melanosomes there, and so people have looked at melanosomes in a variety of like feathered dinosaur fossils to try and figure out what colors these extinct animals might have been. And in this case, we were able to do it for this fossil penguin. And it turns out that Inkayaku appears to have been colored quite differently from living penguins. Like pretty much all living penguins are, for most part, this black and white. There's very strong contrasting colors. Um, but Inkayaku had some gray feathers, and it also had some apparently reddish-brown feathers based on its melanosomes. So this is definitely a character or color combination that we don't really see in living penguins. And so Ilari has done a restoration of it here based on these findings. Now, we of course only have melanosomes from a very limited part of its body, so we don't know what the exact pattern was like, but we can predict that it probably did have gray feathers and it did have these reddish brown feathers. So, yeah, this is a very plausible idea of what it might have looked like. Um, so definitely quite different from living penguins, and perhaps it brings to mind speculation about what this might mean for camouflage and things like that, and whether or not kind of increased predation pressure might have driven the kind of very standard coloration that we see in penguins today. But at least during the Eocene, not all penguins were black and white. All right, should we go to the next one?
Sure. This is
Okay.
cool.
Right. So these early penguins from the Paleogene, uh, they weren't living in quite cold and snowy environments probably, like a lot of the modern penguins do. Antarctica did not fully separate from South America and Antarctica until some ways into the Eocene. And it wasn't until then that we had this, what we call the circumpolar Antarctic current that started to form. And so this is the ocean current that just goes around and around and around the Antarctic continent. And you can see why this current couldn't have formed while Antarctica was still attached to Australia and South America. Um, but once it did, once it was separated and there was a space there, this circumpolar current started to form. And because the water was just staying down there at the South Pole without leaving it, or at least not much of it was leaving, it just got really, really cold there because it was just without any warmer waters kind of feeding it. And so that's when Antarctica's ice caps started to form. And over time, as the Earth started getting cooler throughout the Cenozoic for other reasons too. Eventually, Antarctica became the kind of ice-bound continent that it is today. Um, but for much of the Paleogene, there either wasn't the ice cap at all, or the ice cap had only just started to form and it hadn't completely covered the continent yet. And so a lot of these early penguins were not living in a land of ice and snow. Um, but we do find an interesting adaptation for them that is very useful to penguins today that do live in cold climates. And this is called the humeral arterial plexus, which is a long name, but what it really means is that in living penguins, um, along their upper arm bone, their upper wing bone, there are blood vessels that feed the wing, basically. So blood coming from the heart feeding into the wing. Um, and in most birds, there's basically a single artery that runs along this region and does this job. But in penguins, this artery has instead split into several branches, and they all run across the wing like this. And what's more is that these arteries lie very close to the veins that are coming back from the tip of the wing. So basically, what would happen is that the penguin has this very warm, nicely insulated body, and so the blood flowing out towards the wing is nice and warm and is the same temperature as its core body temperature. It goes through this humeral arterial plexus towards the tip of the wing. Uh, Now, as it goes towards the tip of the wing, the blood cools down because it's towards the extremities. Um, but as the cooled blood is coming back, it flows right next to these humeral arteries that are carrying nice warm blood, and so the cool blood coming back gets heated up by the warm blood and goes back into the body. And in this way, the penguin is actually not losing that much heat because of this adaptation. So it's able to retain its body heat by kind of transferring the heat between its blood vessels this way, which is a very cool adaptation. And as you might imagine, is very useful for cold climates. They don't get chilled. And because the humeral arterial plexus leaves this kind of impression in the upper arm bone of penguins, we can tell when a fossil penguin has this adaptation and when it doesn't. And so people have looked at this in fossil penguins, and it turns out that most stem penguins have signs of this humeral arterial plexus, which is very interesting. And you can see on the left is a phylogeny. Don't worry if you can't read the names. The names in red are the penguin species that have this arterial plexus based on kind of arm bone anatomy, and pretty much most of the names from the halfway mark upwards, actually a bit past that even, are fossil penguins, and you can see most of them have this structure. So, these penguins were not living in a land of ice and snow, so why did they have this? And it is possible that even though they weren't living in cold climates exactly, they went diving in pretty cold ocean waters. The ocean waters might not have been super cold, certainly not like polar regions today, but it probably still would have been colder than the body temperature of these penguins, and so having this humeral arterial plexus would have been very useful for them to maintain their body temperature while they're swimming underwater, especially if they were diving deep into the ocean where presumably would have been even colder. Um, and this feature has been retained in their living descendants, and of course is now a very useful specialization for them to have. So it was kind of exapted for them to live in cold climates. So that's a really cool bit of the penguin story.
Wow, yeah. This is my first time hearing about this study.
Yeah, it's definitely a really cool study for sure. So let's go on to the next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about the oldest penguins, the ones from the Paleocene epoch. And as you can see from another one of Ilari's drawings here, the penguins that we know of from the Paleocene were already quite diverse, spanning a quite range of body sizes. So some of these penguins were giant, like the ones we saw from the Eocene earlier. Like Kumi Manu, for example, was one of these giant penguins. But there were also more regular-sized penguins. Because penguins were already so diverse in the Paleocene, this has led some people to speculate, since penguins had already diversified so far, what if there were Cretaceous penguins? And
Ah, yeah.
yeah, and you could see this in like even very recent penguin papers. And these penguins, for the record, are about 62 million years old, so only about 4 million years after the great mass extinction. And so people have said, yeah, that doesn't seem like much time. So maybe penguins were already around in the Cretaceous and only became kind of abundant after the extinction. Well, I think I've said a lot about my thoughts on kind of timing crown bird origins. And if you need a refresher, you can go back to the first episode in this series to hear some of my thoughts about that. Um, So I'll try not to beat a dead horse, and I know it does come up in some of the later episodes we've done too. I will say I am very skeptical of very extensive neo-avian divergences from before the Paleogene. Um, it's true, we do have a large diversity of penguins from 62 million years ago, but my take, and again, more details in the first episode. Go back to that one if you're curious. My take. I feel like, as paleontologists, we can sometimes lose sight of the magnitude of deep time. Because 4 million years is actually a heck of a long time. I feel like shortly after the Cretaceous, in a basically empty world where there are only a few survivors, these are exactly the kind of conditions where we would expect evolution to work very, very fast. And we have observed in modern day evolution working very fast under the right conditions. So I think it is at least as plausible to me that penguins are a post-Cretaceous thing, like most of the other neo-avian birds, in my opinion, and that they just happen to diversify really fast shortly after the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction, giving rise to the variety of forms that we see in the fossil record. And the oceans are basically empty of large marine predators at this point, like the plesiosaurs and the mosasaurs are gone. So it is quite plausible to me that penguins were doing this. But yeah, definitely a better fossil record would help. I would be delighted if we found Cretaceous penguins that confirmed, the idea that there were Cretaceous penguins, that there was a deep neo-avian divergence. That would be amazing. But yeah, currently I don't think that evidence necessarily points in that direction. There have been rumors, like if you go to the mid 2000s or so, there you can find news articles about people finding fossils of Cretaceous penguins. But those fossils still haven't been described, and I think on top of that, the particular rock units they come from have been redated to the Paleocene. So, yeah. Ah, well. Again, more fossil evidence would be nice. But that is my take on the subject. I've had people ask me about that in the past, so I thought I'd lay it out there.
That sounds totally fair to me.
Yeah, I'd like to think so. Finally, on the next slide, I think this is my last slide about fossil penguins, finally. Not that they aren't cool, but as you can see, there's a lot we can say about them. So here are some images of the actual fossils of these really old penguins themselves, so Sequiwaimanu and Miriwaimanu. And as shown in the previous slide, they're not, not much bigger than a lot of living penguins. In fact, they're smaller than the emperor. And they do have some notable differences from crown penguins. So on the left, just for the record, is the skull of Sequiwaimanu. So you can see that it already has this very long spear-like bill we see in the giant penguins. So maybe it was also kind of feeding in a more spear fishing way and not so much in a biting way like the modern ones do. But on the right here, on the top, is a wing skeleton of one of these early kind of Paleocene penguins that has been tentatively referred to Miriwaimanu, although we're not entirely sure that it really belongs to it, compared to the wing bones of a modern penguin down below. And you can see that the modern penguin's wing bones are really weird looking. They're highly modified. They are really flattened to make that paddle-like structure that the wing is. Well, we talked about this previously in the last episode, but also you might be able to make out that the wing joints in the modern penguin are not very flexible. The wing is basically just this one stiff paddle, and they can flap them up and down real good while they're swimming. But they can't really fold the wing up like a normal bird wing can do. And we mentioned this, how this, helps make a more effective paddle because it's all stiffened and stuff. But, not so good for flight, but that's okay because these guys aren't flying anyway. Yeah, and I'll just say for the record that studying penguin forelimb bones is a huge headache because they're bones are so highly modified compared to those of other birds that it's, you're looking at them and you're like, okay, so is this part equivalent to this other bump in a normal bird wing? Like, what is this? What am I looking at? And yeah, my current kind of research project that I'm doing for my PhD is trying to look at a bird wing bones and shoulder bones and trying to figure out interesting, evolutionary, or rather interesting features I can tell us about their evolution. And so yeah, looking at the penguin wing bones has been, God, God, it's been a pain. I'll just say that. But in Miryuiwanu, as you can see on the top here, it has a much more normal looking bird wing skeleton. Um, like it can actually fold the wings a little bit, like potentially even more than a little bit. Maybe not quite as much as a flying bird can, but it can still do that general motion. Um, and the hand skeleton especially. So the hand is the part towards the right, towards the tip of the forelimb. It basically looks like a normal bird hand, like that. Yeah, that basically looks like a normal bird hand. There are a few features in there that you can point to say, oh, this is probably a bird that was swimming specifically using its wings, or is a diving bird. But in general, it looks very much like the wing of a flying bird overall. So yeah, you can kind of see that transition there. Now, I'll just mention before we move on, probably the one big gap we're missing in the penguin fossil record is what were penguins doing before they became flightless? Because even though Miriuaimanu and these other early Paleocene penguins had pretty normal looking wing bones, they were definitely flightless birds. Um, so, yeah, what were flying stem penguins like? That's still a completely open question. We have absolutely no direct fossil record of these flying stem penguins. So, yeah, we just got to keep digging, I guess. But that is definitely, I would say, the one kind of big mystery in overall penguin evolution at the moment. So, yeah, penguins, excellent fossil record. Definitely, I think you can make it. You can make a very good case that it's the best kind of fossil record of any major bird group. Um, but still missing that very interesting chunk of their story that I think would be very interesting to find out more about. All right, do you have anything else to add about penguins?
No, but except just yeah, I think certainly a great joy that the fossil record is so good. Probably only because like they're aquatic birds and they have dense bones.
That's right.
So that's just wonderful. It is a very fascinating story, and seeing these fossils here definitely has my mind
Yeah.
going all sorts of places. Because like yeah, like the Miri Waimanu, like that arm. I mean, yeah, that looks like like an average, you know, bird wing
Right.
arm thing.
Yeah.
um, Stumbling over my words here,
I mean,
but that's incredible.
yeah, indeed, indeed. So yeah, like I wish like every bird group has had as good of a fossil record as penguins did, but them's the breaks. However, if they did, I think this series would be 10 times longer than it is now. So maybe
That is
on maybe on some level that's a good thing.
well, just gives something to look forward to in the decades ahead.
Absolutely, yeah. Now, even though penguins cannot fly, they become very specialized in a direction where being a non-flyer is very advantageous. Uh, their closest living relatives are absolutely superb flyers, and it's them that we are going to meet next. Um, and so the closest living relatives of penguins are a group called the Procellariiforms. Now, there are over 100 living species, so they're quite diverse. And they don't have quite as good of a fossil record as penguins do, and as you might expect, because these are quite specialized flying birds, so their bones are not nearly as solid as those of penguins, to say the least. But we do have some pretty decent fossils of them, since probably because they are marine birds, and so they often die out at sea and get buried in marine sediments. So we have early fossils from maybe the Paleocene that might belong to this group. Some people even think those fossils might belong to the late Cretaceous or the very end of the late Cretaceous. Wow. Now, again, I would love for them to be late Cretaceous. They would be really cool. But yeah, there's definitely some uncertainty on the dating there, and so I am not completely convinced yet. And again, also those particular fossils are very fragmentary, and so they're like single bones, or maybe not even a complete single bone, part of a single bone. So it's very difficult to tell if they really are, members of Procellariiformes or not, or if they belong to any kind of modern group at all. So yeah, better fossils would be nice as always. Now, definitely from the Eocene onward, we do have definite Procellariiform fossils. And so, yeah, let's see some of their notable features, and they have quite a few. This is quite a specialized group that has long been recognized to share many distinctive features. The Procellariiforms, they have a common name that's sometimes used called the tube noses, and this is named after one of their most distinctive features, and that is their tubular nostril openings. And I mentioned before how a lot of members of Acornithes, kind of this big waterbird group, have the very well-developed nericorn, so the kind of plate, keratinous plate that goes behind the nostrils and the beak, is very well developed. And in the Procellariiforms, the nericorn is so well developed that it forms this kind of tubular structure. So that's why these guys are called tube noses. So their nostrils are kind of encased in this keratinous tube. This might have something to do with the fact that Procellariiforms rely on their sense of smell a lot, and which is very interesting. Now, you might have heard the idea that birds don't have a very good sense of smell, or birds can't really smell at all, or things like that. That is not entirely true. In fact, in large part, it is not true. Quite a few recent studies have been done on looking at the sense of smell in birds, and it turns out that actually a lot of birds, if maybe even most birds, retain a pretty decent sense of smell. Certainly enough for it to be an important part of their lives. But among birds, Procellariiforms have an exceptional sense of smell, and they rely on it for many different things. First of all, they use it to find food. So they'll fly out over the ocean and look for patches of the things they like to eat. So depending on the species, it might be plankton or shrimp or squid or fish. And they use their sense of smell to find where these food sources are most concentrated and find the best feeding grounds. They also use their sense of smell to navigate, so they go on these long travels over the ocean, and they use their sense of smell to find out where they are and where to go next. They also use their sense of smell to find their nests when they're returning to their nests. So Procellariiforms are very specialized for life out over and on the open ocean. But they, of course, need to return to land to breed, and when they do so, usually they nest in very remote regions of the world. So again, islands often, where there are no land predators. Sometimes there are some species that nest out in the middle of deserts, which is quite interesting. Yeah, there are species that nest in the middle of the Atacama Desert in South America, which is one of the driest places on Earth. And of course, there's hardly anything there that's going to bother them. So when they're breeding, and obviously they don't feed on land, so it doesn't matter to them that there's no actual food resources there. They fly out in the middle of a desert and they nest there. Yeah. So the thing is, when Procellariiforms return to their nests, a lot of them do so under the cover of darkness. So even though they tend to nest in regions that are remote, there are as few predators as possible, they do still face threats from predatory bird species, other predatory birds. So things like raptors and skuas and sometimes other Procellariiforms. They'll get to some Procellariiforms are quite rapacious predators. So a lot of time, Procellariiforms, when they're coming back to feed their young, they'll actually do so under the cover of darkness. And when they do so, they'll actually use their sense of smell to sniff out where their nest is. And a lot of them will nest in burrows or rock crevices, protected areas like that. And so they'll sniff out where their burrow is, and then doing that, they can they can come back and feed their young. So yeah, the sense of smell plays a very strong kind of role in their lives. When they're not breeding, they're mostly flying or swimming out over the open ocean. There was a recent study that was done on a species of what we call a diving petrel. So that's a particular type of petrel that is very specialized for wing-propelled diving, and they found that this particular species is called the Wenahu diving petrel. I don't know if I'm saying that right. It was found in New Zealand. It's actually quite a recently described species. Like it was only named as its own species like a few years ago, something like that. And it is, because it has a very limited distribution, it is highly endangered. So people are keeping an eye on them and making sure that their numbers don't fall too low. In any case, there was a recent study that came out about them, where they basically tracked, how long these petrels were spending at sea and all that. And it turns out when they're not breeding, they spend 95% of their time either swimming underwater or like on top of the water. So yeah, they are truly aquatic birds. Um, Now, the diving petrels in particular are weird because they are wing-propelled divers and swim underwater a lot. But a lot of the other Procellariiforms do a lot of flying over the ocean, and we'll talk a little bit more about that soon. But in any case, yeah, they are living out over the ocean, not seeing land for months, and it's only during the breeding season where they finally have to seek out land to lay their eggs. Uh, like the penguins, Procellariiforms are highly K-selected, so they only rear a single young at a time in most cases, and they spend months and months and months rearing this single young to adulthood. So yeah, well, again, we mentioned this, but what they'll do is they'll find some remote location where there are few predators, lay a single egg there, incubate the egg, wait for it to hatch, and then what happens after that is that usually the parents will go out and take these long fishing trips out over the ocean, and then come back and feed the young with what they've caught, and they'll do this for months until the young is finally old enough to become independent. Kind of helping them in these endeavors is a very special adaptation. And this is the fact that Procellariiforms will store the oil from their prey, yeah, like literally from their prey's bodies, in their stomach. Really odd. And yeah, well, what happens is when they're digesting their prey, the protein portion of it and the fat portion of it gets digested in different ways. And so, yeah, the protein, goes through the body as normal, but the fat, when it's processed, it forms this oil that the birds keep in their stomachs and just store it there. What's this oil for? Well, one of its functions is to keep them going on these long fishing trips. It's an extra kind of energy source. So they might fly out of the ocean for many, many, who knows how long, without finding suitable food patches of food, but because they keep this store of oil in their stomach, they can continue to slowly digest that over time, and keeps them going. Something else they use it for is to feed their young. So they'll bring back like fish and squid and whatever, and feed that to their young, but also they'll stock up their young a lot on this oil from the stomach that they'll barf up and feed it to their young. And so, because this oil is, of course, very energy rich, the babies can be fed on it for a long time. And so that allows the parents to go on these long fishing trips without having to kind of come back as often as they otherwise might have to. And finally, and possibly the most unusual function of the oil, is that in some species they have become adapted to use the oil for defense. And it's the juveniles in particular do this. So this is particularly well developed in some of the petrels called fulmars, and it seems that they need this defense because fulmars don't nest in burrows or in rock crevices. Instead, they nest out on cliffs, and the sheer cliffs are, of course, very effective at keeping land predators away, but they are quite exposed to things like predatory birds. Juvenile albatrosses also use the oil as a defense, and this is because their parents build their nests out in the open, not in burrows, because albatrosses are quite big. So yeah, just out in the open, out on like shorelines of islands and other remote land masses, um, where again, you ideally not many land predators there, but uh, quite exposed to aerial predators. And how this works is that if threatened, the baby petrel or albatross will actually spit up the oil in its stomach that it because its parents feed it the oil and it stores it in its stomach to slowly digest over time. And if it gets bothered by some other bird, it'll spit up the oil at the bird and soil its feathers. And you know, well, first of all, it's pretty gross, but it is actually quite a potent defense because what seems to happen is that this oil destroys the waterproofing of feathers in birds. And so if a predatory bird gets sprayed by this oil, uh, it can't keep itself dry anymore. If it goes in the ocean or if it gets rained on, it's going to get soaked and it could well die from the chill. Um, People have done experiments of questionable ethics, I guess, where they've kept fulmars with other seabirds, like in an enclosure. And when the fulmar wasn't happy with those other seabirds, it would spit its stomach oil at them and they would die because they couldn't keep themselves dry.
Wow.
Yeah.
To talk about efficient.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. So as you can imagine, it's a pretty effective defense against these birds, and people are definitely, even under natural conditions, have recorded cases where birds have died from getting sprayed by this petrol oil. Yeah, like even huge predators like sea eagles have been recorded like falling victim to this, and there are also like these some birds that are probably presumably were harmless to petrels, but must have been caught in the crossfire somehow, like little songbirds that got drenched in this oil and died. Like, yeah, who knows how that happened? Yeah, but in any case, yeah, it's certainly quite an effective defense against other birds. So definitely the fulmars do this. Juvenile albatrosses do this. The adults don't seem to, as far as we know. But yeah, it seems likely that this specialization evolved because those particular species nest in more open habitats where the young don't really have a shelter to hide in. All right. Something else, I guess, regarding that is that somehow, and as far as I know, we don't know how, um, when fulmars, for example, get themselves soiled with the stomach oil, it doesn't it doesn't really affect them like it does the other birds. Like they can clean it off just fine somehow. Um, but yeah, for any other bird that gets drenched in it, it's like a death sentence. But yeah, fulmars can get it all over themselves and not worry about it. Um, and I don't think we know how they manage that. um, so, from their reproductive strategy, you might be able to infer that they have a very low reproductive rate. Um, so they invest a lot in a single young every breeding season and have to uh, you know slowly take care of it until it grows up. And even after they become independent, it can take a while before they are actually old enough to breed. And in some cases, even after that, they don't breed that often. Some species, especially like the albatrosses, for example, might not breed every year. They might only breed every other year or so. So definitely very, very slow breeders and very reliant on kind of very stable breeding conditions, you could say. They are very long lived. Even very small species can live for many decades, like 30 years or so. And the oldest recorded wild bird uh, on record is an albatross, specifically a Laysan albatross, who has been nicknamed Wisdom. She's still alive and still rearing young. It has been estimated. I don't think like it's known exactly when Wisdom hatched, but estimated, I think she is probably around 70 right now.
Wow.
And it's interesting because she has been able to successfully fledge young every year since 2006 or so, which is quite a remarkable achievement. Um, like for firstly because albatrosses don't usually breed that often. They might breed every other year, but she has been breeding every year. And also, just to successfully rear young, every time with such a good track record, it takes some doing. So, maybe experience is making a difference in that regard. Definitely wouldn't surprise me. Um, in any case, yeah, they are very long-lived species, but they are definitely very dependent on reliable breeding conditions. And so many of these Procellariiform species are under threat currently for a variety of reasons. One of these is invasive predators. People have introduced, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not, predatory mammals to a lot of the islands that Procellariiforms breed on. So things like, cats and rats and mice even. Um, and they are, of course, not used to dealing with any kind of land-based predator. So the predation pressure from these invasives can be devastating to Procellariiform colonies. Another reason is that adult Procellariiforms, they are expected to be able to live quite long, but there are various factors affecting their mortality now. Um, they might get caught on, in fishing equipment. That's a big danger to them because, of course, they're going after fish, and people who are fishing are going after fish, and so some of the wires get crossed there. They could easily get entangled in fishing equipment and die from it. Um, so yeah, there's definitely some efforts to try and make fishing gear safe for seabirds, or to kind of segregate fishing periods when there are less likely to be seabirds around and things like that. Um, and another major threat is plastic pollution because there's a lot of plastic out there in the ocean, and a lot of times these seabirds are picking up that plastic and mistaking it for food and eating it. And even worse is like feeding it to their young, and of course, their young can't get any nutrition out of that plastic, and their parents are going on long fishing trips where they need energy-rich food sources to keep them going, and so like yeah, that definitely not good. And if you have the stomach for it, you can Google images of like dead albatrosses with plastic just packed up inside their digestive system. Yeah, it's not a nice sight.
Yeah, there's a exhibit. It's a
Hmm.
little tiny one at the L.C. Bates Museum in Maine, which I think I've mentioned on the show
Hmm.
before. And it's straight up, it's a stuffed dead albatross with bottle caps and stuff inside it.
Oof.
It kind of like raise awareness of the situation.
Right, right. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So there are definitely quite a few of them are in trouble. Mm. Well, even so, there are people working very hard to conserve them, and so yeah, hopefully we can keep those efforts going, and hopefully we won't lose more species. There are a few recently extinct Procellariiform species. I'll show a few that are not recent extinction, like not Holocene extinctions, but Pleistocene ones. So definitely they have been subject to some kind of ecological turnover over time for in many cases probably tied to their very specialized kind of reproductive biology. But first, let's look at some of the major groups of Procellariiforms. Firstly, we have the albatrosses. Albatrosses are known possibly from the Eocene onwards, definitely from the Miocene onwards. Um, they are known from 20-ish living species, and I say 20-ish because there is a lot of controversy about exactly how many species, like how much should we split, that kind of thing. That is a very intensely debated subject. So yeah, pretty much I think every kind of major bird checklist lists a different number of species of albatrosses. So yeah, around 20. Around 20. I think that's good enough for this series. They can be found across the Southern Ocean and also in the North Pacific, but they can't be found in the North Atlantic anymore. But we do have fossils of them from North Atlantic regions, so they used to be around. It might be because there aren't really any suitable breeding locations for them in the North Atlantic currently. The most recent North Atlantic albatrosses lived in the Pleistocene, and they probably died out or stopped breeding there because Pleistocene sea level rise. So because the Pleistocene ice age is a whole series of sea levels rising and falling and rising and falling, and probably during one of those periods of sea level rise, their nesting habitat got drowned out and they couldn't live there anymore. So that's the most recent example of a North Atlantic albatross colony. But other than that, they're not currently there anymore. Um, and albatrosses are very, very big. So they are some of the largest flying birds, or at least they include some of the largest flying birds. Even the smaller albatrosses are, at least like 2 kilograms in body mass. So they're not small birds by any means, but definitely the really big ones get really big. The biggest species currently is the wandering albatross, which has the longest wingspan of any living bird, over 3 meters. So, yep, quite an impressive bird. I have seen, I have not been lucky enough to see a living albatross in person, but I have seen a stuffed specimen in a museum. In fact, in the Cambridge Museum of Zoology here is the one I'm thinking of. Um, it is mounted next to a cassowary, and of course, a cassowary is quite a large, flightless bird. And the albatross, in terms of volume, takes up about the same space as the cassowary. The legs of the
Wow.
albatross are much shorter, of course. And But yeah, like the albatross, even with its wings folded, like in that mount, its wings are not even spread to its full wingspan. Even with its wings folded, it takes about the same space as the cassowary. So that tells you something about how big they are.
That's awesome.
Yeah, yeah, they are huge. Yeah, I would love to see one of them in life. They must be incredible. Um, in terms of body mass, I think the large albatrosses get to like over 10 kilograms, something like that. So yeah, they're definitely among the largest flying birds around today. Of course, they are much smaller than the biggest flying birds ever to live, which were well, in terms of wingspan, were the pelagornithids, which could get over twice that wingspan. But we talked about pelagornithids in a previous episode, so I won't belabor that point here. Nonetheless, albatrosses are super impressive in their own right. And what they do with this huge wingspan is that they're very specialized for several particular types of soaring over the ocean. So these are slope soaring and dynamic soaring. So, I am not a flight biomechanist by any means, so I am probably going to completely butcher the explanations of what these types of flying are. But nonetheless, I can try to give it a shot in a very simple terms that I can personally understand. And if you are a flight biomechanist or someone familiar with aerodynamics or something, you are free to like call me a moron in the comments or something like that. But anyways, the very simplified explanation that I understand about these types of flying. So, slope soaring is basically making use of kind of raised regions, like say the side of a valley or the side of a really big wave, which in the case of an albatross is more likely. The air tends to kind of be pushed upwards. They by the change in topography here, right? So you get this very strong kind of uplift in this kind of region, and so albatrosses are well equipped to take advantage of this kind of situation where there are big waves and big updrafts associated with them, and so they can use these updrafts to soar high into the sky. But in terms of traveling far over long distances, um, they use this other method called dynamic soaring. Okay, so let's see if I can explain this. All right, so during dynamic soaring, what happens is that uh, an albatross or any other animal or any other or even any other flying object that is trying to use this method, um, it'll fly up into the wind and fly up high into the sky, kind of onto the wind in a windward direction. Then it turns with the wind, blowing from behind it, and then it flies very fast downward, shooting towards the substrate below it, with a tailwind behind it. And so in doing so, it's gaining a lot of momentum when it's like kind of flying downwards in this way, right? And so it does that, gains a lot of speed, and then what it does is then it turns slightly, and then turns into the wind again, and then uses the momentum to carry itself up, back high into the sky, and then repeats that again and again and again and again and again. So it's just doing these series of turns like along, back and forth into the wind. And it's a very efficient way of traveling long distances because an albatross can do this and basically not have to flap at all throughout its entire journey. And the way I described it, you think it's like doing all these kind of very sharp turns, like a looping around all the time. But people have actually, put tracking devices on albatrosses to look at their flight path, and it turns out that they only really have to turn very slightly to use this kind of dynamic soaring. So they just have to adjust themselves a little bit, and then they get carried into the air, and then they shoot down along, pushed along by the wind, and then they turn a little bit and fly up into the air again, and then they keep doing this and doing this over and over again, and they can basically travel the world in this manner. So dynamic soaring is a method of soaring that's pretty much only used by seabirds because you basically need a very kind of clear, kind of open environment to do it. Otherwise, you might be running into like trees and mountains and what have you. Right. So birds that soar on land or over land don't really use dynamic soaring, but seabirds do, and albatrosses are pretty much masters of this type of travel. With their extremely long wingspans, it makes them very good at doing this. Now, even though they are really good flyers, albatrosses don't do much actual feeding in flight. So what they do is when they see something they want to eat, they travel these long distances and they finally come across a food source. What they do more often is they'll actually land on the water surface and just grab prey from the water while sitting and swimming. Sometimes they are known to dive for very shallow depths, just under the surface of the water. They're not particularly specialized for it, but they're capable of it. But yeah, otherwise they're mostly kind of sitting on the surface and grabbing prey like that. Yeah. Do you have anything else to add about them?
Well, I think your description worked out okay for me. Like as you were talking about like their kinds of soaring, I could picture it in my head.
Yeah.
Um, Interesting, they're very good flyers, but as I understand it, when it comes to landing, they're kind of like loons.
Right. Right.
Um, oh, wait, I'm flipping it. When it comes to taking off into the air,
Right. Right.
like they're kind of goofy birds.
Yes. Yes.
I'm sure like y'all can like see certain nature documentaries and how they
Right.
kind of have to take a running start and they're flapping their long wings and their heads kind of going all over the place as they're trying to do it. And
That's right. Yeah. Yes.
it takes a little bit of effort to get up into the air, but eventually they do it.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, yeah, and that is true for most of the Procellariiforms, but it definitely affects the albatrosses most because they're the biggest and have the longest wings. Yeah, and that's very true. And in part, that is because their wings are so long. So they, even though their hind limb mobility is not as restricted as they are in a loon, um, it's very difficult for them to be able to jump high enough that they have enough clearance to actually flap those wings. And so what they do more often is actually take a run so they can get into the air. So either over land or over water. And yeah, it can be pretty goofy watching them do it. And yes, in albatrosses, the landings can also be quite an affair too, because they also have to kind of run a few steps off when they touch down.
If of course anybody's curious about their animation history,
Mm-hmm.
the reason in the Rescuers films that Orville and Wilbur are albatrosses in the first place is that originally they were going to be pigeons, but then one of the animators or the higher ups was watching like one of the old nature documentaries that the Disney studio used to make and seeing the footage of the albatrosses taking off, and they were like, "Oh, this is just rich for, right, for like animation." So
Wow, that's interesting. And there we go. There's a nice use of making use of a species biology and deciding to feature that in your film.
Yeah, imagine that.
Right, right. So yeah, but definitely very interesting and very specialized birds. On the next slide, I show a few fossil albatrosses. So there is Platornis from the Miocene of Italy and Aldiomedes from the Pliocene of New Zealand. And you can see, these are pretty decent fossils, especially Aldiomedes is known from its skull, which is really nicely preserved. Um, Platornis is one of those extinct North Atlantic albatrosses, so it's from Europe, and in this case, it's known from a few scattered bones, mostly wing bones and hind limb bones. Interestingly, both of these species are much smaller than living albatrosses. Like even the smallest living albatrosses are bigger than these two. In any case, let's go on to the next group of Procellariiforms, and suddenly we are downsizing quite a bit because yeah, so this is a group called the southern storm petrels. Um, Now, there are two different groups called storm petrels, and we'll meet the other one next. But it used to be thought that they all formed like a group, basically. But it turns out that within the Procellariiforms, they are not each other's closest relatives, it seems, um, from the current evidence that we have. So now they've been split apart, and so we now consider them as two different groups. So one group is the southern storm petrels. And they can actually be found worldwide, but most of them breed in the southern hemisphere, and that's why they're called southern storm petrels. Now, there are only 9 living species, but they are quite abundant. In fact, they are some of the most abundant seabirds around. And they are called storm petrels because people often saw them when storms were happening. Like they would take shelter next to ships and things like that. Um, but yeah, that's the reason. The storm petrel fossil record is not particularly good because storm petrels are tiny little birds. Like the smallest ones are like sparrow sized. They're dinky little things. So as you might imagine, their fossil record is not superb exactly, quite limited. So they're known from the Pliocene onwards, but we don't know much more of them beyond that. Now, they have a very interesting kind of behavior, and this is called pattering. And you can see one of them doing this in this photo. And what they'll do is they'll kind of sort of seem like they're landing on the water's surface while they're flapping their wings. And while they're doing this, they will pick tiny food particles off the water surface. They like to eat like little plankton and maybe very, very small fish, things like that. Very curious, and it looks a lot like they're walking on the surface of the water while they're doing this. But what they're really doing is they're actually dipping their feet just under the surface of the water, and that kind of anchors them in place. And while they're flapping their wings, they're either flapping their wings or sometimes they're soaring into the wind. So what they're doing is they actually turn themselves into kites, basically. Not the bird kites, but the kind of flying object kind of kites. They're basically turning themselves into kites and using their feet as the string, anchoring themselves to the ocean, and so they can kind of stay in place and pick off little food particles from the surface of the water. Um, Otherwise, they don't soar much. They since they're very small birds, they mostly flap out of the over the ocean. And again, I've never seen any of these in real life. I've never been lucky enough to go on a kind of a open ocean pelagic bird watching trip, but I've seen video of them, and they are so small, and they look so delicate, just kind of fluttering over the waves. But other than breeding, they spend most of their time over the open ocean. It's incredible that they can do that. Uh, they look almost. I've seen videos of them flying, and they look almost like misplaced butterflies or something. The way they flap their wings, but
Oh,
yeah, but yeah, they live out over the open ocean, and they are just as good as it added as their larger relatives are. It's quite incredible.
I think it's interesting that like all the times I've been to the coasts, like I can't recall ever seeing a single Procellariiform.
Yeah, me neither. They're definitely primarily open ocean birds. Like they might get close to the coast if there's a big storm happening just where they were feeding and then they need to take shelter or something. But yeah, it's pretty rare. Otherwise, it's just mostly it's some of the species that breed on coastlines, like continental coastlines, like fulmars might be seen relatively frequently. But yeah, other
Right.
than that, you're most likely to see them on like pelagic birding tours. And yeah, I've never been able to see one before, so definitely something I'd like to fix in the near future. Um,
Yeah, same here.
um, So, the next group are the northern storm petrels, which we now consider to be a separate group from the southern storm petrels. But even as far back as the 19th century, there were people who speculated, maybe they're not that closely related. But it was pretty strongly debated until quite recently we finally have the genetics, and it seems that it's true that the northern storm petrels and the southern storm petrels are actually two distinct groups that are not each other's closest relatives. Um, the fossil record of this group also isn't spectacular, although I will show a fossil on the next slide. There are more species of northern storm petrels than there are of southern ones, um, although they are more limited to the northern hemisphere. They can get a little bit over the equator, so they are technically found worldwide, but you're not going to find them in the southern oceans most of the time, for example. So yeah, that's why they're called the northern storm petrels. Um, and in terms of behavior, they're pretty similar. They also do the patterning kind of feeding strategy that I described earlier, but they tend to have a bit longer wings and shorter hind limbs compared to the southern storm petrels. So that's one of the ways that they can be told apart. On the next slide, I have a fossil of a northern storm petrel. It was described in the genus Oceanodroma, but a lot of taxonomic authorities now say that it should be lumped into that the genus Oceanodroma, that is, should be lumped into the genus Hydrobades. Anyways, we do have a fossil of a that has been assigned to a northern storm petrel, and it is pretty complete, especially for such a small and delicate bird. You can see the skull there, you can see most of the vertebral column and a hind limb. So yeah, it's pretty similar to a modern species in most respects. So there's not too much to say about it, but it is pretty cool that we have this one fossil. All right. Finally, let's look at the true petrels. And there are over 90 species of these guys, so more than all the other tube noses combined. There might be fossils that belong to this group from the Eocene onward, definitely by, I think, Oligocene onward. And they are found pretty much worldwide, like the entire world's oceans. They roam all across it. Yep, you can find petrels everywhere, pretty much. The seven seas. In terms of their ecology, they are very diverse for Procellariiforms. So yeah, as you might imagine, with so many species of them, there are many different feeding strategies that they have adopted. In terms of size, they actually basically span the range between storm petrels and albatrosses, overlapping a little bit. So the largest petrels are actually a bit bigger than the smallest albatrosses, and those are the aptly named giant petrels. And those guys are scary looking. If you haven't seen pictures of giant petrels, you should look them up because they are pretty intimidating birds. And they are scavengers, so they will feed a lot on like dead seabirds or seal carcasses or whale carcasses that washed up on the beach. But they are also predators of other birds, and they will hunt smaller birds. They will hunt things like baby penguins and both the babies and adults of like other Procellariiforms. Um, there was a recent paper that was wow, it was quite striking to see the video of it. It was a recent paper describing behavior in giant petrels, and what they showed was that they were attacking like adult albatrosses, and one of the smaller species of albatrosses, not the big ones, but still, albatrosses are not small birds, no matter what the species, at least in present day, and these giant petrels were just walking up to them in the dead of night, which is a pretty scary thought to think about, in the dead of night, and they would kind of show up next to the nests of these albatrosses, and the albatrosses would try to defend themselves and lunge out at the petrels, but when they did so, that seemed to be kind of what the petrels were counting on, because they would, when the albatrosses lunged at them, they would grab the albatrosses and then drag them off their nests and then pull them
Okay.
off camera. Yeah.
That's nuts.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. And the researchers, when they visited those areas during the day, would find dead albatrosses from the aftermath of these attacks. Whew, yeah, so giant petrels have gone quite a pretty, I don't know, spectacular route in terms of their feeding strategy. But a lot of the other petrels are, fish eaters, squid eaters that's flying out over the ocean. A lot of them, like the albatrosses, will land on the surface of the water and grab prey. Um, Others are wing-propelled divers, actually. So some of them will dive down into the from the air and then swim for quite a distance using their wings. There's a really nice footage from the original Blue Planet, showing this, where it was a bunch of, it was one of the usual, a bunch of marine predators ganging up on a hapless school of fish and just kind of
Oh
utterly
yeah.
decimates it. Yeah, and the seabirds in that scene, or these many of them were shearwaters, which are a type of petrel, and they were just diving down into the water to grab these fish. It's quite incredible. And of course, I mentioned briefly earlier the diving petrels, which were a group of petrels that are so specialized for this wing-propelled diving that for a long time they were thought to be like a completely separate group from like the true petrels. Yeah, they were classified in their own, quote-unquote family for a long time, but now we know that they're actually nested inside the true petrels, and so yeah, they are in fact true petrels. But their wings are not shaped quite like those of typical petrels, but are more like a wing-propelled diving birds. Much shorter, more suitable for flying through the water. Um, they are quite incredible swimmers. Something interesting I've read about them doing is that they are able to, while they're flying through the air and they come up against like, a breaking wave coming up in their way, they can fly right through the wave and then kind of continue, flying through it and then emerge through the other side, still flying without skipping a beat. It's,
Yes.
yeah, really cool. Definitely another group of birds I really want to see in real life. Um, and there are also some petrels that are filter feeders. So there's a group of petrels where they have these very weird, specialized kind of flattened bills, and they have little lamellae inside their bills. Like we've talked about lamellae before. We've seen them in like ducks and their relatives. We've seen them in flamingos, and we've seen them now in these petrels. And it's for a very similar purpose, for filtering out food in the water. So yeah, super diverse group. On the next slide, I show some examples of fossil petrels. We don't know a huge amount about the early evolutionary history of petrels, but there are some sites where we find very well preserved petrel fossils. Um, and so one example was just described earlier this year, like a month ago, something like that. Is Procellariiforms from the Pliocene of New Zealand. A lot of great seabird fossils have come out of this particular site. The small albatross skull I showed earlier also comes from this site, and one of the penguins, Eudyptes adatu, also comes from this site. So yeah, nice place to find seabird fossils. A more recent extinct species is Calonectris wingati from the Pleistocene of Bermuda. Um, and this is probably another species that was wiped out by like the sea level changes during the Pleistocene. So it's probably breeding on Bermuda once upon a time, but during one of the kind of sea level rise episodes, its breeding grounds were probably submerged and it just couldn't breed anymore. Um, so yeah, just some examples of extinct petrels. There are others too, but yeah, just to show you that we have some nice fossils of them. Do you have anything else to add about petrels?
No, not particularly. No.
Cool. All right. So finally, we'll talk about a particular extinct Procellariiform on the next slide. This is a Rupelornis from the Oligocene, and is known from several species from the Europe and the Middle East. So I guess kind of surrounding the Mediterranean region. It's pretty unusual. It's got some pretty weird features. In terms of its forelimb proportions, is pretty similar to your typical petrel, but its foot anatomy looks a lot like some of those southern storm petrels, and so very odd. So people have speculated, oh, maybe it was doing something similar to those storm petrels, that pattering behavior, where maybe it was using its feet to anchor itself to the ocean surface while kind of flying above it. So that's certainly a possibility. Um, it is quite a bit bigger than most of the storm petrels. It like about twice as big. So it wasn't huge, but it was not. It probably was not doing things exactly like they were. And it's not clear what kind of Procellariiform that this particular genus was. The recent phylogenetic analyses have recovered them as either stem Procellariiforms or stem albatrosses, which would be interesting. Now, the authors of that particular paper said that the evidence that they are stem albatrosses is not that great, so the characters linking them together are not very strongly indicative of relatedness, so maybe that's an artifact, and they consider it more likely that they are stem Procellariiforms, but definitely a group to be researched more. And we have some pretty good fossils of them, as we can see here. Like, this is pretty much a complete skeleton. The two limbs on top here are the feet, and it's the wings that are down the bottom here. And yeah, so it looks kind of funny. It's like in a very funny kind of death pose. And its head is kind of bent upwards back and back. So yeah, that's why it looks the way it is. On the next slide, I show kind of the phylogenetic summary of the Procellariiforms. The Procellariiform phylogeny is fairly controversial, actually. Like, there have been a number of different studies, and they mostly found very different topologies in terms of their internal relationships. But currently, this seems to be the most recent understanding. So the northern storm petrels are actually more closely related to the true petrels than to the southern storm petrels. So again, those two do not in fact form a clade. And the albatrosses in recent analyses come out as the sister group to the rest of them. Rupilornis might be a stem Procellariiform, a stem albatross, so I showed it in Apollitomy. And that's the state of the art as of now. All right. Anything else to add before we wrap up?
Nope.
Cool. So finally, on the last slide, I show the general relationships between this big waterbird clade, whether you want to call it Natatores or RDA or something else. Well, we'll see what the scientific community decides. So the Phaethontimorphs are the kagu and sunbittern and tropicbirds, and they are sister to the acornithes, the core waterbirds, or that's what they're often called in the literature, at least, the core waterbirds. With the loons being kind of the odd ones out in that group. The penguins and Procellariiforms are each other's closest living relatives, and they together form a clade called Austrodiptornithes, or the southern diving birds, which is a very nice name. I think it's a very suitable name for them. The Procellariiforms, of course, can be found in all over the world, but they're most diverse in the southern hemisphere, so I think it's a pretty appropriate name. Some other people also call this group Procellariimorphae, which is fine too. It's a bit more straightforward and less evocative, I think, but still, it's a perfectly fine name. And wait a minute, because I see here that there's a group that we haven't covered yet. That's right, because there is still a big diversity of acornithes that we have not covered in this episode, and this is the pelicanomorphs. That is a group that includes storks and herons and boobies and cormorants and, of course, pelicans and several other groups too. So that will be, on the next slide, the preview. Next time on Dinosaurs, the second chapter. In most of the waterbird groups we looked at today, we were looking at groups that were super highly specialized for like open ocean environments. Like they were living and feeding far out at sea and only coming back to land to breed. But acornithes, kind of branched out and found other ways to benefit from aquatic environments, other ways of foraging in aquatic environments, and other ways of being aquatic predators. So we are going to meet some of these other ways of being an aquatic dinosaur next time on Dinosaurs, the second chapter. Now, lastly, acknowledgements. As usual, Henry and Alicia have their usual contributions, and thanks especially to Ilari for his paleo art and for giving me ideas for what to talk about regarding penguins. If you want to keep up with us, follow us on Twitter or on our YouTube channel. You can email us if you got questions or comments, or just leave a comment on the videos. That's also we're also quite happy to see those. And as always, there are references to the resources I used for this episode in the description. And with that, I think we can wrap up. Next week's episode should be a news episode because March is starting up. Geez, how did that happen?
Yeah.
But I believe the week after that we'll go back to Jones' Human Evolution series, and I can't wait for that.
Yeah, we're going to talk about Homo sapiens finally.
Wonderful.
And the subsequent Stone Age time periods of Africa.
Excellent. Definitely look forward to hearing that. And with that, everybody, please stay safe and take care. Until next time.
Yes, thanks for joining us. Take care.
King penguins for lanternfish deeply can sound more than 1,000 feet, where their prey can be found, and their pear-shaped eggs may weigh 2/3 of a pound. What a start for the great penguin waltz, the great penguin waltz. Aptenodytes, Patagonicus, look good in their nighties, oiled waterproof, with warm down for their flighties, under the sea in the great penguin waltz. Pygoscelis genus, a daily gen 2, and from South Georgia, South Chinstrap, shake their tails too, with their nests neatly made of fine stones they can woo fair maids in the great penguin waltz. They swim out for krill, squid, fish on the way, can travel 100 miles in a day and make it 20 miles per hour gangway. It's feeding time for the great penguin waltz. A daily's millennia passed 8 fish tails, while more krill were devoured by fur seals and whales, till we killed them, which tilted the South Sea coast scales. Now the krill feed the great penguin waltz. But if climate change puts krill on the ropes, can a daily switch back? Well, we know they're not dopes, but we can't catch too many fish dashing their hopes, so they can still dine in the great penguin waltz. You dip these good divers with crests so jaunty, like old Yankee Doodle a macaroni, or hopping on rocks on the Isles by the sea as they dance in the great penguin waltz. First lay a small egg in the usual way, then a bigger one comes and the first rolled away, and in winter time can swim 10,000 K before heading back south to the great penguin waltz. For ages the penguins have bested the cold, the orcas and leopard seals skua so bold, with so many stories still left to be told if we cherish the great penguin waltz. Far to the south the Antarctic clime has nurtured this dance through nature's deep time of avian love, reason and rhyme, a black and white swirl, the great penguin waltz.